Chapter 8:11. The stickiness of the inner layer of the fish skin increased rapidly. At first, it only stuck to the flesh and blood of the wound. But soon, the inner layer of the fish skin, which was derived from the living tissues of the mutants, had a strong reaction with his body. The two fused further until it was difficult for them to interact. Old Kong seemed to have heard some kind of high-frequency roar that was full of bloody and violent emotions. Soon, he was also influenced by this emotion. In a trance, the distance between them was blurred. He almost thought that the high-frequency roar came from his mouth. After he got the fish skin equipment, there was a simple instruction manual that stated, "The current situation is that the aberrant features preserved in the fish skin have infiltrated into Old Kang's body tissues with a special technique and formed a temporary aberrant reaction. It's like injecting a wave of adrenaline into Old Kang's body and activating new strength." This strength was not for nothing. It was accompanied by a strong rejection reaction, but it was enough to support him through the rest of the journey, if nothing unexpected happened. Those people in the wilderness really know how to play tricks. Blood continued to gush out of his mouth, but Old Kong felt that his condition was a little better. At least he could use the superiority of a city man to ridicule those who he had never met before. Of course, he was still thinking about the key parameters on the life support system interface. Old Kong had never been to Claw Island before. In fact, among the 4 members of the liaison group who crossed the ocean to Ban City, the one who had been to Claw Island had already been killed by the military. He could only stumble and fumble forward according to the route and way of passage stored in the chip. He entered the drainage system of the forward base of Claw Island from the periphery of the lake, which meant that he had reached the entrance of the secret passage. The drainage system, which had been idle for many years, had become a gathering area for the rich aquatic species of Beishan Lake. To be more precise, it was the hunting ground of a certain group of mutant fish. This was originally one of the cover of the secret passage. People who were familiar with the situation could use other methods to pass through, but Old Kong didn't have this concept. The aquatic species in the drainage system smelled the abnormal smell of blood. Some fled in all directions, and some swarmed forward. Old Kong was not afraid. He twisted his body, which was indistinguishable from a human body and a fish body, slapped and bit, and forced his way out. The battle seemed to have injected new strength into him. After forcing his way forward for hundreds of meters, he saw a thick metal gate behind the muddy water in front of him. The purpose of the gate was to prevent the large mutants from invading the forward base on Claw Island. Old Kang's destination was not the forward base, but the side passage near the metal gate. This was installed by the church members of Ban City after the base was abandoned. It could use the base's small drainage system to connect to the large drainage system at the bottom of Beishan Lake, which had already flooded the city. It was a complex and secretive safety zone. Even ability users needed special diving equipment to stay there for long periods of time. Equipped with the fish skin, Old Kong could almost achieve half of his goal as long as he entered the tunnel. Not moving. Amidst the surging mud, broken bones, and flesh at the bottom of the water, a muffled shockwave spread. Old Kong hit the entrance of the passageway. Nothing changed except that the water was more turbid. His authorization chip controlled the fish skin to transmit the signal. It had already connected with the gate of the pathway, but there was no further response. Even though Old Kong had knocked away all the mud and shells wrapped around it, it remained motionless, coldly lying in front of him. The electronic lock had failed. There seemed to be a spare mechanical lock, but the one who was familiar with this place was already dead. *T, *T, *T. Right now, the little bit of energy and consciousness that Old Kong had left was truly not enough to solve such a complicated problem. After continuous setbacks, and also under the continuous attacks of the surrounding aquatic species, the toxicity and rejection reaction of the mutated trait finally took effect. The muddle-headed instincts of a wild beast quickly suppressed the remnants of his consciousness. He cursed loudly, but it soon turned into inarticulate hissing. He was still fighting the school of mutated fish, occasionally releasing high-frequency sound waves. The fish skin had already deeply fused with him. At this moment, Old Kong was like a big fish that had swallowed poisonous bait, struggling at the bottom of the water. His consciousness became more and more hazy. In the end, there was only one thought left. Dig forward. Dig forward. No matter what, dig forward. He gradually stopped paying attention to the fish that were attacking and biting him. Again and again, he hit the entrance of the tunnel and the metal gate. In the muddy water, he kicked up mud after mud. He did not know fatigue or pain. He just wanted to dig through the obstacles in front of him. After an unknown number of collisions, he exerted force once more, but the front was suddenly empty. Not only that, but the tunnel opened underwater and sucked him in. It sucked him into the water and flung him behind the metal gate. He passed. His hazy consciousness suddenly shook, but he was a bit dazed. He seemed to hear a sigh that resembled a human's. Was it a misconception? He quickly tossed it to the back of his mind. Even though he was a bit more clear-headed, he still let his habitual pure emotions take over. Dig, dig. His life as a miner wasn't an experience worth reminiscing about, but he was able to survive. This was an achievement worth being proud of. He had to survive before completing the mission. Just like this, Old Kong entered the deeper layers of the waterway. He entered the ink-stained pitch-black domain. How dazzling, said Luo Nan, who had just returned to the dock. Mister? Yin Lu turned her head. She couldn't see any dazzling light source in the pitch-black night. Even the lights on the yacht were quite reserved. Of course, Luo Nan had always been like this. God knows what sort of wonderful scenery he saw that ordinary people couldn't imagine. Luo Nan didn't explain, nor did he get on the boat. He just opened up a virtual work area on the dock. He opened up a topographic map of Ban City and its surrounding areas. His fingertips started from the location of Claw Island. He followed a special route and extended all the way to a certain point northwest of Beishan Lake. He asked Yin Lu in snake tongue, "Where is this?" Yin Lu recognized it with a glance. "Mister, this is the Fair Trade Market where the Days Society's processing plant is located. It's also the location of the Ban City Vagrant Exchange." "Then what about this place?" "Huh?" Yin Lu was stumped. "What's wrong?" Yin Lu couldn't help being astonished. "This is the Days Society's processing plant. Did something happen here?" Luo Nan raised his eyebrows and drew a circle around the surrounding area. "It shouldn't be a problem to get here in 2 hours, right? Right now?" Yin Lu subconsciously looked at her wristwatch. It was currently 8:22 in the evening in Ban City. It would be almost midnight by the time they arrived at the Fair Trade Market. She was puzzled, but she still quickly guaranteed, "There's no problem." "Do we need to contact the Days Society to go to the processing plant?" Luo Nan finally considered the problem of the sky. "Isn't it a bit late? The nightlife of the people of Ban City is quite rich. It's very normal to socialize until midnight, or to start socializing in the middle of the night. Plus, the current situation is special. Ao Ping Rongsan shouldn't refuse." Yin Lu brought out the level of a secretary and quickly found a reasonable reason for her boss. As for how unreasonable the reason was, she wouldn't even consider it. As for offending Ao Ping Rongsan and the Days Society, this was completely meaningless. Luo Nan thought for a bit. "Let's go take a look at the processing plant. Take a look at the equipment and the technical workers." Yin Lu first responded yes, then she reminded him, "Mr. is going to make an appearance. It's best to take care of your image. It's fine as long as it's passable. If it really isn't possible, then we can borrow Snake Tongue's yarn of invisibility." Snake Tongue slightly bowed to the side. This could be considered a response. Yin Lu responded again and let Snake Tongue push Luo Nan onto the yacht. She immediately contacted Ao Ping Rongsan to discuss the itinerary. Under the curtain of night, Old Hand hurriedly walked out of the assembly workshop. His head was lowered, and his already stooped body shrunk even more. His footsteps were hurried, and he was like an old monkey that had strayed from its flock. He was very impatient. He subconsciously tucked his right hand into his sleeve. The warning signal that came from afar seemed to form a high temperature like soldering iron. It made his wrist faintly ache. This kind of warning signal represented that someone had passed through the sluice gate under Claw Island and entered the secret waterway. The sensors installed in the waterway were also continuously positioning themselves and giving warnings. It could be seen from the warning signal that the fish skin was indeed made by him. However, the damage was severe, and the person who came didn't strictly follow the operating procedures. All of this made Old Hand very uneasy. Master Show, the special agent is calling you. His apprentice rushed out from the workshop behind him and shouted. Say I'm busy. But, where are you going? A majestic figure wrapped in a suit blocked in front of him. Okira Rongsan happened to come to this side of the workshop and blocked the person. Old Hand's eyelids twitched. Io, special agent, hello. Okira Rongsan didn't want to lower himself to his level. He simply said, the bidder is here to inspect the situation. I need you and I to receive them together. They will arrive in 2 hours. Old Hand blurted out, which idiot is coming at this time? Okira Rongsan glanced at him coldly. For most people, this scar-faced man who used to be the charge leader had a ghost-like murderous aura. However, Old Hand stared back without showing any weakness. An ugly face could be used as capital. He had seen mutant beasts that were 10 times uglier and 100 times stronger in the wilderness. Didn't they all survive? In this factory, Old Hand really wasn't afraid of anyone. He had skills, apprentices, and savings. At the very least, he was 75 years old. For the old man in the wilderness who was suffering from old injuries, it was enough. Could this bunch of Japanese eat him? In the end, Okira Rongsan didn't do anything to him. He patiently explained, this customer is the most likely partner of the employee stock ownership plan you proposed. The other party needs to understand the factory's equipment, personnel, and technical situation. As the workshop supervisor, you are the most suitable person to receive them. Holding shares was to let a group of old brothers and little kids have a foundation to settle down. However, now that danger had suddenly arisen, he didn't have the mood to socialize. Old Hand stiffened his old face and replied stiffly, my stomach hurts. I want to shit. The Labor Protection Department has gastrointestinal medicine. You have 20 minutes to solve it. Chapter 8:12. About an hour and a half later, Old Hand finally saw the legendary big idiot, oh no, the big customer. At this time, Old Hand's heart was already burning with anger. Damn it, it was said that the other side had arrived early. Making people wait for an hour and a half in the middle of the night, Old Hand thought that he was a very ostentatious person. But unexpectedly, only 2 people came down from the luxury yacht that sailed into the dock, and one was disabled. He was pushed down in a wheelchair. It was a man and a woman. The man sat in a wheelchair and looked relatively young, but his specific age couldn't be seen. The woman looked like a white-boned spirit secretary, and she had a professional and cold demeanor. But in the eyes of Old Hand, this woman was the kind of hypocritical slut. Intentionally or unintentionally, she kept an intimate distance from the man in the wheelchair, as if she was afraid that others wouldn't know. Okira Rongsan didn't have the cold look he had in the factory, and the lines on his ugly face softened a little. He brought the factory's management and went forward to welcome them. Old Hand followed behind the welcoming team with a straight face, listening to those people's greetings. The man in the wheelchair didn't say much. He only said that his surname was Imo, and it was mainly the female secretary whose surname was Een who spoke. Listening to their background, it seemed that they were also important figures of a certain order, but they weren't from Ban City, but from D City, which was far away. This time, they came to Ban City mainly to make some investments. It sounded quite reliable. After all, they were both in the Pacific Ocean, and the raw and semi-processed products of aquatic mutants on both sides had competition and complementation, so the market was still relatively popular. And the Castle Consortium that Secretary Een mentioned had some brands under it. Even a relatively closed old guy like Old Hand had heard of it. It was a very powerful high-end sports brand, and it matched the main product line of the processing plant. Old Hand had to admit that if it was another time and a different situation, he would be very tempted. But now, the signal from the secret waterway of the old city was constantly approaching, and it made him upset. The speed of the other side was getting slower and slower, and it took a lot longer than expected. Was there a problem? If Old Hand was free now, he would definitely rush into the Beishan Lake to carefully investigate, or to provide support. How could he be like now, wasting time with these capitalists? Especially when he heard Ao Ping and Rong San's suggestion to find a place to have a drink, the veteran's lungs were about to explode. At this moment, the man in the wheelchair, who was only grunting in response, opened his mouth. We're here tonight because we want to get the right impression of our investment target. I hope that the equipment and technical staff in the factory are in good condition. It's getting late now. Let's go to the factory and discuss on the spot. The other party's meaning was somewhat vague, but his will was very firm, so Ao Hei Rong San naturally would not refuse. Fortunately, among the crowd, the anger in Veteran's heart was slightly suppressed. The welcoming convoy at the pier quickly turned around and left in a grandiose manner. The Veteran and the big client were not in the same car. He didn't know how they communicated with Ao Ping and Rong San. He could only hold his wrist and force himself to believe that the man in the wheelchair kept his word. The situation seemed to be slowly improving from the worst. The Ping trade market was not the central CBD. The nightlife was not that rich. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the trading center and most of the shops were closed. The location of the day's processing factory was also relatively remote. The journey was smooth, and they returned to the factory in about 10 minutes. The two sides should have communicated again in the car. After getting off the car, Ao Ping and Rong San dismissed the irrelevant people. Only the production and financial supervisors, as well as the veteran, the senior technical staff, followed them. The group went straight into the factory and took a detour along the tour route. The production supervisor probably remembered the words of the man in the wheelchair. When introducing, he specifically said, "The factory's production line is reliable equipment that has been verified for many years. We have also been doing orderly updates, and the state is very good. From raw material processing to rough processing, it has achieved automation. There are many types of deformed materials, such as bones, wood, fur, and even flesh. It is difficult to subdivide and coordinate the large and small categories. It is rare to see a similar processing factory like ours." Idiot, that's because the equipment is old and only goes for the low end. The veteran criticized in his heart. This production supervisor was an old member of the day's church. His level was really average. Usually, they almost made him a figurehead. The good thing was that he was relatively peaceful. As long as there were no accidents on the production line, there would be profits every year, and he was willing to be a peace officer. But now he was timid, and it made people feel ashamed. The man in the wheelchair obviously did not care about the production supervisor's promotion. He leaned back in his chair and did not look at the tour window. "I want to understand the practical ability of the workers. In this field, the human factor is more important than the equipment most of the time. The practical level of the workers, we are also very good." The production supervisor was already timid. As he spoke, he stepped back and winked at the veteran at the same time. The latter pretended not to see it. Compared to the production supervisor who was eager to complete the business, Ao Ping and Rong San were much calmer. According to the requirements of President Song Ping, the processing factory was not the only business to be dealt with during this period of time. He also had to consider the joint employee acquisition plan of Jiang Zhuang and others. The relationship was complicated, and it could not be rushed. But because of the employee stock ownership problem, in order to make the future arrangements appear more natural, he hoped that the key figure, the veteran, could show his face in front of the investors and leave an impression. Therefore, he also signaled to the veteran to let this awkward old guy take the lead. The veteran was determined tonight, and he still pretended to be deaf and dumb. Ao Ping and Rong San frowned. At this time, Secretary Yin projected a virtual workspace, and a series of data charts appeared on it. She casually scrolled a few times and said, "From the current situation, you have been carrying out customization business, but the performance is not outstanding. With all due respect, in the vagrant exchange and the inner world, this is a very important standard. There is a big difference whether there is unique technology or a well-known craftsman in the industry. Technology and talent need to be more detailed. Ao Ping and Rong San finally said, "Mr. Mo, please visit the assembly workshop. That place uses the most manpower, and it is a relatively core link." The man in the wheelchair asked casually, "Is there a project in progress?" This time, it was Ao Ping and Rong San's turn to be silent. He turned his head and looked at the veteran. The veteran's eyelids twitched, and in the end, he gave in and replied with a hoarse voice, "It's just those routine orders, underwater thrusters, deep diving equipment, and so on, deep diving equipment." The man in the wheelchair said a few words and agreed to Ao Ping and Rong San's suggestion. They spent 5 minutes to go to the assembly workshop. Just as Ao Ping and Rong San said, the number of workers in the assembly workshop seemed to be more than the previous workshops combined. Because of the large number of people, even though everyone was in work clothes, and very few people talked back and forth, there was still an atmosphere that was completely different from the cold machine production line, which could be felt through the visitation window. The veteran liked this kind of atmosphere the most. It made him feel like he was back in the wilderness, in a dilapidated cave, assembling those crude but life-saving equipment with his old buddies. The group of guys in the workshop, in groups of 3 to 5, whispering numbers, and coordinating the rhythm, was undoubtedly taught by him. It was old-fashioned and rough, but it was powerful. The veteran unconsciously raised his chest, like a lion patrolling its territory, arrogant. At this time, Secretary Ian flipped through the information and said, "The ratio of the workers employed by the factory is quite high. Hey, city people." The corner of the veteran's mouth twitched. He had seen this kind of people many times, and now he was too lazy to be angry. On the other hand, Ao Ping and Rong San calmly replied, "Here, they are the main force. That's right, after all, this is the world's largest colony of modified people, and it is also a semi-public experimental base for infected people with mutations. We don't discriminate against this, and investing in the fair trade market can't avoid this kind of thing, but the related labor protection measures must be seriously considered. This is also for the benefit of the workers. A bunch of black-hearted capitalists." The veteran hated this kind of hypocritical tone the most, and simply walked away. At this time, his ears were filled with other voices. "This is the deep diving equipment that Master Shou mentioned?" It seemed that the man in the wheelchair's curiosity continued until now. When they talked alone, he was quite polite, like a junior, and his attitude was very low. The corner of the veteran's mouth twitched, and it was considered a smile. The man in the wheelchair straightened his back, and his gaze passed through the visitation window to watch the workers operate. The deep diving equipment was a kind of mid-range diving equipment that used various mass-produced parts such as steel, plastic, fabric, and other materials, but they were all in a supporting role. The key was to use the special materials from the aquatic mutants as the axle and to do a good job. The parts were all assembly line products, but the main materials had to take into account the special nature of the material to achieve balance. Every set had a slight difference, so it could only be done manually. The veteran could see that the man in the wheelchair was very serious and methodical in his observation. He stared at a group of people, from the beginning to the end, to understand the assembly process, and then based on the main materials, found the group with the most similar nature, and stared at the whole process. This went on for 7 or 8 minutes before the man in the wheelchair opened his mouth again and sighed. "Very unique design. The combination of practicality and refinement is very good." "Is this the wilderness style?" "It's not even that good." The veteran was immune to this kind of superficial praise. "The molding strip on the back, the wear rate is still high." "Oh, an expert." Just based on the man in the wheelchair's grasp of the nature of the main materials, the veteran knew that this person had a very good eye. But he didn't expect that he also had a way in design. It's inevitable when it comes to force movements. But it also depends on how it is used. It's definitely not a problem to slowly adjust and run in, but young people these days are impatient. Yes, it needs to be done in advance. But in the front, we can do some special refinement and nurture work. The formula technology related to the separation of special characteristics may still have room for improvement. Can you understand it? The veteran's face became solemn, and he thought for a moment before saying, the formula and craftsmanship are our livelihood. But if we allow technology to invest, everything can be discussed. As soon as the words came out, the veteran wanted to slap himself. So many problems. The man in the wheelchair didn't express his opinion. I roughly understand. Let's stop here for tonight. Chapter 8:13. That was it? The man in the wheelchair was surprisingly easy to talk to. The task of receiving guests tonight was much easier than he had imagined, which made Old Hand a little uncomfortable. The man in the wheelchair, who was obviously an expert, also left a very deep impression on him. He came and went as he pleased, didn't talk much, and only cared about technical issues. And that pair of eyes. He didn't think much of it at the time, but now that he thought about it, it was like a mirror, very transparent, and could reflect some things. He was definitely a capable person, and it wasn't good to cooperate with this kind of person. The other side didn't seem to be too interested, so he could only take it one step at a time. After sending off the man in the wheelchair, Old Hand used the excuse of not having enough energy and asked for a leave from Enrich. He returned to his little nest, quickly equipped himself, and snuck out of the peace trade market through a secret route that he had already planned. After making a small detour, he returned to Beishan Lake. The peace trade market was located on the northeast shore of Beishan Lake, which was next to the Misty Mountain Range. If one were to go further into the land, it would be the publicly recognized wilderness. The crust of the islands was relatively brittle, and from time to time, there would be volcanic earthquakes, which made the wilderness particularly restless. In addition to the terrestrial species that appeared in the forest, the aquatic species at the bottom of Beishan Lake were also quite irritable. Every year, the peace trade market hunted a large number of mutants for raw materials processing, but at the same time, a large number of human lives were thrown into the mountains and lakes. Of course, the so-called human lives had to be discounted in the eyes of some people. The topic that Secretary Een and Enrich had discussed was the key. Why did the vagrant tribe of Old Hand come to Ban City? It was because they had suffered from a relatively serious mutant infection, and the tribe couldn't hold on any longer. If they wanted to receive the so-called humanitarian aid from the Star Alliance Committee, the condition was that they had to go to a designated place, sign an agreement, and voluntarily become the relevant living research material. That was the place that Ban City's peace trade market was. On the northeast shore of Beishan Lake, there were dozens of public and private laboratories of all sizes, all of which were doing this kind of work. Every year, a large amount of research funds were invested into it. As for the trade market with the vagrant exchange under the sign of the Equal Trade Promotion Association, it was nothing more than the careful and meticulous government merchants of Ban City arranging for the continuous flow of experimental subjects to make a living. He could also earn a small sum of money at the same time, so why not? For example, the Great Zay cult could exchange the experimental resources in their hands and send them to their own factories to work. That would be another wave of income. Back when old Luo was struggling in the wilderness, how could he have received such treatment? He was willing to risk his life with everyone to form a friendship, but look at what happened to him. Therefore, it could be said that the veteran had long seen through it. Perhaps it was because he was old and couldn't stand the torment anymore. Tonight, the veteran had a lot of emotions. All kinds of distracting thoughts only gradually settled down after he dived to the bottom of North Mountain Lake. The signal was still there, but it hadn't moved for a while. The place it stopped at was a supply point in the old city's waterway at the bottom of the lake. The water depth was more than 180 meters. If a normal person did not have special equipment, it would be impossible for them to dive there, let alone stay there for a long time. Veteran looked at his own situation and estimated that even if he was fully armed, he could only stay there for about half an hour at most with the power of his equipment. If the person who came over was still alive, he would have been struggling in the deep water for nearly 2 hours. For such a situation to happen, he was either a strong person with extraordinary physique, or the fish skin, I hid at the supply point in the open sea is a scam. The veteran had already prepared for the worst. He went out from a sewage outlet on the shore of North Mountain Lake and dived step by step. When he reached a depth of 60 meters, he activated the underwater thruster and entered the city's waterway at the bottom of the lake. For safety reasons, the annual maintenance of the waterway was personally led by the veteran, so he couldn't be more familiar with it. It only took him about 15 minutes to reach the vicinity of the supply point. There was still a considerable distance before a muffled vibration came from the dark and lightless water. It was intermittent, and in the relatively quiet deep water, it seemed too intense. Of course, there were also mutants in this water area. With such a sound, they had most likely been disturbed. The veteran circled around for a while, but in the end, he gritted his teeth. He held the underwater thruster in one hand and took out the high-pressure gun that was specially used for deep-water combat in the other. His speed didn't decrease, but instead increased as he rushed toward the area where the sound was the most intense. By the time he arrived, the situation had already calmed down. The sound coming from this area was muffled, and it was mixed with some fragmented noises. The underwater camera that the veteran was wearing collected weak light, temperature difference, sound waves, and other information in the deep water area. It combined all of these to form a blurry circle of images. This was a concrete building in the old city. It used to be about 7 or 8 stories tall. They could last longer than those steel high-rise buildings. Even after being submerged underwater for 40 years, the external outline still maintained its basic appearance. However, compared to the last time he came here, the middle area of this building had a wall that had fallen off, forming a water vortex that shuttled in and out. When the veteran approached, it gradually calmed down. The speed at which the veteran approached was even slower, allowing the underwater camera to adapt to the subtle changes in the environment. By the time he quietly passed through the gap in the building, he had a relatively clear grasp of the internal environment. A fierce battle had just happened here, and most of the traces had been washed away by the water. However, both sides of the fierce battle were still here. The veteran locked onto the target in the corner. It was a streamlined figure. At first glance, it looked like a large fish that was as long as a person. However, at this time, the skin of this large fish had fallen off in many places, revealing the outline of a human skeleton and some metal-like structures inside. At this time, this half-man, half-fish monster was tightly hugging a giant octopus that was obviously a mutant species. It used both its hands and mouth and fins to tear and gnaw at the octopus continuously. It looked like a beast or a demon. The veteran stared at this scene in a daze, momentarily speechless. When he created the fish skin and placed it in the supply point in the open sea, he had already expected this day to come. Therefore, the instructions were very solemnly written down, the relevant precautions, and indicated the worst consequences. However, he was very clear that when it came to risking his life, these things were nothing. Life, after all, was chosen by oneself. The veteran silently raised the high-pressure gun and aimed it at the figure. If he was already late, the only thing he could do now was to let this person die with some dignity. The other party didn't notice at all, but the veteran hesitated. After all, he still hadn't confirmed the details of the other party's state. Also, although the high-pressure gun was called a gun, its range in deep water was still very limited. He didn't have the confidence to hit it in one shot. After thinking for a moment, he released the underwater thruster and quietly moved forward. Unexpectedly, after advancing a few meters, the person in front of him suddenly turned his head. The bionic fish head that wrapped around the head was already half damaged. In the deep water and high-pressure environment, the exposed face was also highly distorted, and part of it was still stuck to the fish skin. One of the eyes had already exploded, and the flesh and blood were badly mangled. There was still a strip of the mutant octopus's meat hanging from the side of his mouth, making him look as ferocious as a ghost. However, the other party's reaction was unimaginably calm. He just slowly turned around and stayed in place, not reacting to the muzzle that was pointed at him. A glimmer of hope appeared in the veteran's heart. He also stopped, raised the muzzle, and maintained a safe distance. At the same time, he opened his own diving equipment's communication device. He caught the other party's signal and connected. A second later, the communication channel was formed. "Hello, can you hear me? Who are you?" "Ha, ha, ha." What came through the communication channel was only meaningless throaty sounds and panting, and occasionally one or two high-frequency screeches. There was no way to analyze it at all. The veteran's heart sank again. It was very obvious that activating the mutant trait within the fish skin, and actively forming a mutant infection in order to obtain short-term power had already wiped out the other party's ability to speak. The veteran tried to send a text message, but there was also no response for a long time. This was normal. The mutant infection had already destroyed the other party's nervous system, and his brain function had already changed. It was already quite amazing that the other party could still maintain a relatively clear mind after such a long time. And perhaps this was all he could do. The veteran wanted to slap himself in the face again. This is the good thing you created. Wait a minute, there's still a way, the kind that is often used in educational activities. The veteran tried his best to calm his breathing, concentrate, and use his pitifully weak soul power to sketch out a certain special structure. According to the church's philosophy, one flower cannot grow into spring, and one tree cannot grow into a forest. Ordinary people without talent could only rely on collective cooperation to survive a great calamity that could come at any time. Only then would they be able to build a shelter for themselves and their fellow believers, huddling together for warmth. The veteran himself did not have the ability to realize telepathic communication, but if the other party was really a member of the church, the water rippled, and the mutant octopus that had already been torn into pieces smashed over. The veteran was startled, and he subconsciously raised the high-pressure gun again. He quickly came to a realization. With the structure of a mollusk, and the fact that he was nearly 200 meters underwater, it was impossible for him to cause any damage. Furthermore, apart from this throw, the person on the other side only twisted his body in place, stirring up the water ripples. There was no follow-up attack. "Then, you won't let me use it?" "Ha, ha, ha." "Is there danger?" Other than panting, there was no other sound, so the veteran knew that he had guessed correctly. But with the current situation, he could not keep guessing. He could not imagine the specifics of the situation at all. What should I do? At this moment, the hideous body in front of him moved, slowly moving forward. The "ha" sound came from the communicator again. He could tell that the other party was trying to make his voice steady, revealing his desire to communicate. Want to get closer to communicate? The veteran was a little hesitant. That's right, he had joined the Soul Order, but he could not be considered a devout believer. He saw it more as a partner who huddled together for warmth, and this was also in line with the teachings of the church. Now, he was asked to risk his life. Bah, a man in the wilderness had all sorts of bad habits, except for one, and that was never a coward. The veteran forcibly stabilized his body and watched as the other party approached bit by bit. He also watched as the other party used chaotic and even ridiculous movements to make all sorts of signals. It was very difficult to understand, but the veteran was shrewd and ruthless at this moment. He remembered the experience of learning the sanctuary technique when he first joined the church. Recalling the scene at that time, he freed a hand and stretched it forward. Just like that, he touched the body in front of him that was neither a human nor a fish. The cold and slippery touch was faintly discernible through the diving suit. However, apart from the simple and crude touch, he also felt a little bit of warmth. It did not belong to the cold and gloomy lake water, but to another world of nothingness. It turned into a warm light and slowly traced a trajectory. Chapter 8:14. The reason why Veteran was called old was that he had reached the age of 80. In today's era, he could barely mix in the ranks of the middle-aged and old, and not completely fall into the circle of the elderly. But in fact, he was still old. Not only did his energy and physical strength decline, but his memory and ability to accept new things had also become worse. It was even more impossible to improve what he wasn't good at before. The mental aspect and soul power had always been his weakness, and it was even more impossible for him to make sudden progress. The warm light from the mental aspect outlined the structure of the trajectory. It didn't seem complicated, but there was a certain requirement for accuracy. And since it was a cooperation, he had to find the right rhythm. Space and time, the multidimensional precision challenge was very unfriendly to Veteran, and it greatly slowed down his learning progress. Once, twice, 10 times, 20 times. Gradually, counting became meaningless. More accurate, more accurate. Veteran didn't know how long the other person could persist, but when even his own attention began to be exhausted, the other person's state could be imagined. The more it was at this time, the more he couldn't rush. It was such a simple principle, but it was too difficult to do it. Unknowingly, under the diving suit, he was already covered in sweat. Even with the interference of buoyancy and water pressure at the front of his palm, the weight seemed to be increasing. He knew that it was the weight of death. The situation was getting worse. After a series of failures, the light trajectory of the other person's demonstration also had problems. Even a veteran, who was a semi-amateur, could tell that Meng Chao was right. The details were off, the structure was unstable, and the function was not formed. At first, there would be 1 or 2 problems in 10 attempts, then 3 or 4 times, and then half and half. Veteran really wanted to shout at the other person, if the F*King shelter can't be built, then it won't work. It's better to find a random god and worship it. Besides, isn't there a design? My ability to read pictures is top-notch. What's the point of doing this mysterious oral teaching? But all the emotions and distracting thoughts settled in front of the other person's seemingly endless demonstration over and over again. Veteran sighed and laughed. Fine, I'll accompany you until I die. I still have this bit of patience. If I can't learn it in the end, go over there and curse me. What he got in response was a breathless silence, another demonstration. But since he had spoken, the veteran had completely let go. He was no longer stubborn. Instead, he supported the person opposite him and searched for a more stable and comfortable position in the sunken building. He leaned against the mottled concrete wall and let his old bones recover. I'm not distracted. I'm just suffocating to death and need a breather. Old people don't use their muscles and bones as their strength. Being able to retract and release them freely is the best condition. Don't blame me. I've been a good teacher all these years, and I can't stop talking. The more I talk, the more spirited I become, and the more excited I become. Just don't let me disturb you. Come, let's continue. The boring study began again, and the mouth of the veteran never stopped. It was like a small wave on Beishan Lake, washing away or at least diluting the taste of despair inside and outside. Time ticked by. Well, you did pretty well this time. I was just a little bit off. Let's continue. You came to find me. Have we met before? After spending so much time together, I do feel a little familiar. You came to find me because you trust me, old show. Don't worry, I may not be as stubborn as you. I'm a little worse in terms of teaching and methods, but my mouth is tight, and I know the word benevolence and righteousness. This time, after learning it, I'll definitely find a trustworthy child to pass it on. Oh, just a little bit off again. Hey. Don't be distracted. Oh, you choked. Come, let me pat you. At least half of your bones have been replaced with steel. Speaking of which, you should be one of the people who came to preach before. I have some impression of you. Forget it, let's not stray from the topic. Let me tell you, there are a lot of good boys and girls in our group. They were all trained in the wilderness. Back then, I followed old Luo for a while, and they were also arrogant. Your shelter, it's us. This doctrine is quite good, and we all like it. Who can we count on in the wilderness? It's ourselves, and the companions we can trust. With this shelter, the originally illusory things can be quantified, and the efficiency has increased. It's quite good. This is quite similar to what Little Boo said back then. She's a good girl, but good people don't live long. We believe you just because you preach. Do you really think you can spout lotus flowers? In the end, I still feel that it's kind and suitable. It's really suitable, you know? I also used the shelters method to create a purification and tempering method. It's specially used to separate out the mutated characteristics and forge equipment. Here, it's the one you're wearing. It's good, right? It's just that the after effects are too great. Look at you, I'll have to think about how to improve it later. You can't be a guinea pig for nothing. Hee hee, I don't think I should say that. You must be cursing me in your heart. Scammer. The information traveled through the void, and the veteran instantly became speechless. It was also at this moment that a clicking sound came from the nothingness. It was as if the parts were riveted and the modules were connected. From top to bottom, from inside to outside, everything fit seamlessly. It was as clear and refreshing as before. On the mental plane, a simple and clear structure was erected. It was just a combination of basic parts, but it was surprisingly stable. This still couldn't be called a shelter, but the foundation was already under construction, right? The temporary, teaching space that was drawn out became turbulent. Countless hazy shadows shuttled back and forth. There was also the clanging of metal and stone, and a hoarse roar. It constantly pounded at the heart and brain, burning hot. The veteran wasn't surprised. He already had a similar experience when he first came into contact with it a few years ago. This should be the accumulated emotions of the other side for a long time. It carried a large amount of information. But unfortunately, he didn't have the ability to distinguish them one by one. He could only watch as they popped like bubbles after a dazzling display. In the midst of this, only a curse was rather clear. Lousy tricks of the wilderness. The veteran quickly reacted and retorted, "TSK, city people. It's rare to see someone like you. Hey, what's your name again? You should at least let people know who this old man screwed over. TSK, city people are poor and generous." The darkness was still darkness. The dim light from the equipment couldn't penetrate the darkness. The surrounding material environment didn't change at all, but the veteran could see a weak and stubborn radiance extinguish. Half of the support of the nothingness world disappeared. The foundation that had just been erected collapsed, collapsing without a trace. This old acquaintance, who he might have seen before, but he couldn't recognize, had died in the end. The veteran couldn't do anything. He could only be certain that Luo Nan had already memorized the construction drawings of the new shelter in his mind. There wasn't a single mistake. When the color of the sky brightened, Lu carried a tray of food and quietly arrived outside Luo Nan's bedroom. Snake Tongue was kneeling there in silence. Her posture was refined and steady. It was as if she could maintain this posture forever. She wouldn't feel any fatigue or slack off. After returning last night, Luo Nan had forgotten to return the veil of invisibility to her. So today Snake Tongue appeared in front of others with her original appearance. She had an extremely similar silhouette, but with just a few additions and subtractions. There was a gloomy and cold air that was rarely seen in the Northmont snow drawings. It was hidden in the tips of her brows and the corners of her eyes, causing the surrounding air pressure to drop a bit. Only then did Lo remember that this was a powerful B-rank power known for being sinister and mysterious. Even though she had the Blood Flame Order behind her back and had gained many benefits recently, she still wasn't Snake Tongue's opponent. However, Lo couldn't help but feel a bit of a conquering delight when she saw such a powerful character acting humble and small. She was like this, yet the person in the room was actually able to face her with indifference. She really didn't know what kind of structure his brain had. 100 thoughts spun in her mind, but her face was calm and without a ripple. She spoke in a businesslike manner. "Is Mr. inside? He didn't sleep all night. He's probably still drawing." Lo hesitated for a moment, but she still walked forward. Snake Tongue opened the lattice wooden door at the right time and invited her inside. Luo Nan was still dressed as Boss Missouri from last night in the bedroom. His belt was still untied, and the effect of the veil of invisibility was still there. He sat upright on the tatami, holding an electronic pen in his hand as he faced the virtual work area in front of him. One could see that his eyes were densely bloodshot, and he looked quite tired. His hands didn't make any substantial movements, but he kept on drawing in a small area. It looked like he was a bit excited. But overall, he was just staring blankly. Since she came in, Enlu called out softly, "Mister, would you like to have some breakfast?" "Just put it there." Luo Nan responded quite quickly. He clearly wasn't focused or daydreaming. Instead, he was in a state of being overrun with distracting thoughts. Enlu could only obey. She and Snake Tongue, who had followed her in, laid out the plates. During this time, she couldn't help but let her gaze drift towards the work area. All she saw were hazy and chaotic lines and blocks of color. It was like a sea, but it wasn't a sea. The general structure was a bit familiar. Right when she was guessing, she suddenly heard Luo Nan's command, "Go find out about the matter of technology investment." Enlu was stunned for half a second. Only then did she remember that the so-called technology investment was something that the awkward old man mentioned last night. She didn't think that Luo Nan would actually take it to heart. "Yes. I'll contact Ao Pingrong and Rong San right now. Or I can directly contact that person." Veteran. "Ah, yes, the old hand." Luo Nan continued to stare at the work area. He didn't even turn his head. "Also, organize a copy of the Soul Order's information and give it to me." "Yes. That's right. There's also the Deep Blue World. Earth's current development of the Deep Blue World aside from the research projects of the Deep Blue Platform. For example, minerals and the like." Enlu was a bit stupefied. She knew about the Deep Blue World, but this place was only known to people in recent years when the Deep Blue Walkers entered the military. Whether it was the mortal world or the inner world, they knew very little information about this place. The Blood Flame Order didn't have any relevant reserves. Plus, the span of these three commands was a bit large. She was completely unable to grasp the connection between them. Chapter 8:15. Enlu was unable to grasp Luo Nan's train of thought by relying purely on her imagination. She didn't dare to ask any more questions. Suppressing the doubts in her heart, she got up and prepared to do her work. But Luo Nan called out to her at this time, "Hold on. Help me take a look." Luo Nan pointed at the work area. "How do you feel?" It's like the sea, but it's not the sea." Enlu honestly described her previous feeling, including the inexplicable sense of familiarity. Luo Nan nodded. Then he waved his hand, and the chaotic and hard-to-understand scene in the virtual work area before him split into two layers. They peeled off, turning from 1 to 2. So that was how it was. Out of the two paintings, one of them was the source of Enlu's familiarity. She had seen it many times. It depicted the storm and thunder on the sea, and the intertwining tornadoes. There seemed to be several powerful forces corresponding to them, and one of them had been erased a few days ago. As for the other one, it should be Luo Nan's work from last night. Enlu looked over and couldn't help thinking, this should also be a psychic diagram, right? The structure of the drawing was vaguely Luo Nan's style. The reason why it was vaguely was because of the brushwork, especially the grasp of the shadowy shades. There was quite a bit of difference compared to the concise lines of Luo Nan's sketches. At first glance, his new work looked more like an oil painting. It had a prominent texture, and the layers of dark colors formed the main background of the painting. After the previous overlap, Enlu naturally felt that the painting was showing the bottom of the sea where the light couldn't be seen. The stacked color ripples were the undercurrent surging in the deep sea, giving off a heavy and gloomy feeling that could drown and destroy everything. Enlu soon realized that there was a soft light at the edge of the darkness. The light was so weak that it could easily be mistaken for the projection backlight of the virtual workspace. However, if one were to look carefully, they would know that this was indeed the effect of light and shadow drawn by exquisite brushwork. Part of this beam of soft light scattered in the darkness, and part of it crossed the boundary of the painting. Although it was not completely visible, it still illuminated some things. What did you see? Luo Nan's words rang in her ears. Enla didn't have time to think at all. The words in her heart blurted out, light, there are still people struggling. Enla saw some blurry silhouettes near the gentle light. They looked like people, but they weren't. They existed at the boundary between light and shadow, as if they were using light to dispel the darkness, but also as if they were rushing to a brighter world that was not shown in the picture. The exposed limbs and face were distorted in the light, but the first impression that they gave Enla wasn't ugly. On the contrary, there was a certain tension, which was why she described them as struggling. Afterwards, he forced himself to speak a few opinions, and Luo Nan finally gave a slight nod in return. Enla naturally assumed that Snake Tongue would also be asked next. She shifted her gaze, but Snake Tongue didn't respond at all. I asked her last night. What she said was similar to what you said, nothing new. It was a rare negative review, which made Enla feel depressed in her heart. And at this time, Luo Nan brought up a hand-drawn picture. This picture was even more concrete. She could see the back of a woman at the center of the picture. She seemed to be standing on a beach near the sea. Far away was the exposed silhouette of the upper hull of a ship on the curved surface of the sea. Enla had just come back from the pier of Ban City the day before yesterday. With a glance, she was able to recognize the scattered architectural lines, especially the silhouette of the wing on the high platform. It was no different from the luxurious private business jet parked on the jadeite light. Oh, she seemed to have found another reason why Luo Nan paid special attention to the jadeite light. She heard Luo Nan murmur, I didn't draw it wrong, but there are still links missing in the middle. Too many links are missing. I can't put them together. It's the same even if I add this. Enlu immediately imitated Snake Tongue and lowered her head. This was definitely not a field she should meddle in. Reality proved that in certain fields, the method of gathering the masses for mutual benefit was unworkable. Enlu and Snake Tongue withdrew one after the other, leaving Luo Nan alone. He quietly gazed at the three psychic pictures, watching them come together from time to time, piecing together a few seemingly right, yet actually wrong, fragmented illusions. Was he in too much of a hurry? Luo Nan rubbed the space between his eyebrows, allowing his swollen and aching eyes to ease a bit. Last night, the victim possessed an intense consciousness of a minor. The struggle of the final stages of his life had given Luo Nan quite a bit of inspiration. Luo Nan's telepathy followed the minor from beginning to end. At first, it was because the minor had wrapped himself in fish skin and was moving stealthily at the bottom of the lake. He was actually able to hide from Luo Nan's perception. If the hidden door to the sewage sewer hadn't been damaged and caused a commotion, Luo Nan would have been completely unaware. Later on, Luo Nan found it strange that there was such a stubborn and unyielding character in such a notorious and illegal order. Then again, the source of the damage to the hidden door was Luo Nan. It was caused by the powerful electric field that destroyed the surrounding electronic equipment when he borrowed the help of the biological reactor to repair his cellular tissues. Under the effects of curiosity and guilt, Luo Nan gave the minor a hand. He helped him break through the checkpoint and enter the old city sewer. Originally, this matter was more or less settled. But Luo Nan captured the signal waves transmitted by the sensors in the old city sewer. He followed the clues and found the old hand. Things got out of hand from here on. Let's not talk about the emotional level for now. The minor and the old hand exchanged a great deal of information. For example, the shelter. These were things Luo Nan had never come into contact with before. He had never imagined it. Looking at the shelter from a different angle, what was the difference between it and the Ring of Blood fortress that Luo Nan had single-handedly constructed? The Soul Order's missionary operation should have already been underway for a period of time. In other words, similar results already existed in this world before Luo Nan brought out this configuration technology from the virtual brain system. Such high-end technology hadn't even caused a ripple before. It was clearly abnormal. There was also the old hand, an old comrade who had once lived together with his grandfather and the others in the wilderness. This was truly a pleasant surprise. Why did Luo Nan come to Ban City? Aside from searching for Snake Tongue and designing a trap to deal with Gong Qi, the other reason was to find Wu Jun. He wanted to find and clarify the relationship between her, his grandfather, and his parents. He wanted to confirm relevant information about the Wilderness Laboratory. He hadn't found Wu Jun yet, but he had encountered a replacement who wasn't inferior in any way. Perhaps this person didn't know the core secrets of the laboratory like Wu Jun did, but listening to the old man talk about a few matters of the past was pretty good, right? If it was possible, Luo Nan wanted to run over right now, grab the old hand, and chat with him for 3 days and 3 nights. In the end, he didn't make the trip. Aside from the current delicate and dangerous situation in Ban City, there was another reason. Luo Nan had gained something from the miner's lesson to the old hand. When the foundation of the new version of the shelter was constructed, there was a brief opportunity for a mental exchange. The old hand's attainments in the mental side weren't enough, so he was unable to read the information within the miner's gushing emotional strength. But Luo Nan was different. Perhaps he could be considered the world's most powerful bystander. It wasn't just in that instant. During the final 2 hours of the miner's life, the miner's hazy yet rich emotional thoughts were reflected in Luo Nan's mind. The destructive mutation infection was an incurable disease that Luo Nan had no way of treating. The only thing Luo Nan could do was to let this tough guy, who hadn't even been able to leave his name, leave a few more traces in the world, even if it was in the memories of others. Right now, there was still the psychic diagram. Luo Nan's gaze stopped on the newest scene of the deep sea. Actually, whether it was Yin Lu or the earlier Snake Tongue, they were only talking about the part that could be seen. The soft light at the edge of the scene seemed to be a place of light in contrast to the darkness. But in the miner's memories, it was also a place where powerful radiation wreaked havoc. It was a deep-sea furnace that was doomsday-like. It was a place where countless souls struggled and screamed. Even though there was indeed the existence of hope within. But what was the more realistic situation? Luo Nan only had the miner's fragmented memories. They were scattered and shapeless. Therefore, he needed the support of other information. Therefore, he wanted to use the psychic diagram to forcefully surmount the barrier of knowledge and extract the most core answers. Reality proved that he was far too greedy. There were far too many missing links in the middle, so much so that the psychic diagram itself was showing a tendency to be edge-shaped. Mr. Bai had once told him that he couldn't force this type of psychic result. Otherwise, his consciousness might fall into nothingness. No matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't be able to fill in that vacuum. Actually, he could fill in a bit more. Luo Nan always felt that there were still some things inside. They already existed, but they were hidden too deeply. Or perhaps the fragments were too severe. The order was completely disrupted. If he could capture a clue to order within the chaos. Luo Nan subconsciously put pen to paper on the virtual work area. He suddenly came back to his senses a few seconds later and looked at the work area. There wasn't any clue on top of the work area. Instead, it was the outline of some world's periphery. Luo Nan's pen technique had probably improved again. A few strokes were already enough to form the appearance of an abyss. It was to the extent that the light in the work area was clearly warped, flickering indefinitely. Sigh. It's best if I don't court death right now. Luo Nan broke out in a cold sweat from shock. He felt weak for a time, so he simply fell back and gasped for air on the tatami. The angle of the light that came through the porthole was leaning to the west. He had unwittingly stayed on the yacht for nearly a day. Things were clearly progressing, but what was with this feeling of not making any progress? A notification from the external neuron vibrated within his brain while he was in a daze. Offline test question database download complete. Luo Nan suddenly sat up. This was much slower than he had expected, but it was still a success in the end. His consciousness immediately moved towards the tree-hole space within the mist maze. He was probably affected by the unforeseen event just now, but he was actually a bit nervous when he cut in. He always felt that the enormous power of the abyss world from the depths of the whistling and rushing sandstorm could crush over at any time. In the past, he felt that it was too far, too chaotic, too ethereal. But now he began to worry about the problem of gravity. Chapter 8:16. Luo Nan's consciousness entered the virtual brain interface once more. 2 days and 1 night of downloading did not bring about too obvious of a change. There was only a new notification pop-up waiting there, covering the information refresh window. The notification said, "Offline test question database download complete." It seriously lacked a sense of ceremony. Luo Nan was affected by this and was worried about the gravitational problem of the abyss world. He didn't have any special feelings. He directly chose to confirm. The notification pop-up disappeared and the information refresh window behind it appeared. New but familiar characters appeared, initiating verification procedure. Confirming activation of offline test procedure. Owner's genetic data has not been entered into the database. Results are being entered. Overall results fail. If he knew that he had to re-enter the questions, he would have taken advantage of these 2 days to do a few more sets of questions and increase his basic points. Luo Nan chuckled in his mind. Then he saw the follow-up information continue to roll. Additional question database data pulled out. Determining additional question difficulty as spacetime configuration Heaven Stairway Level 2. Selecting questions. Without any buffer, a clear change appeared in the virtual brain interface. The background of the deep starry sky began to expand. The central virtual brain galaxy seemed to come head-on. Millions and millions of stars shuttled and flowed, then scattered in all directions. It represented a process of drawing closer, enlarging, and focusing. The stars became sparse and felt even more distant. A deep void filled most of his field of vision. But soon, the surface was smeared with a relatively rich color. The main source was a large blazing fireball in the distance. Because the light emitted was too intense, it passed through the diffraction and refraction of certain interstellar matter, forming an enormous warped dynamic facula of light. It blurred the proper spherical shape. A portion of its elongated extension was like a spewing light whip and tongue of flame. It cut across a small portion of his field of vision. And so Luo Nan knew that he should have entered the range of a certain planetary system. He was able to observe the star's sun from a close distance. While he was still analyzing, his field of vision was completely out of his control. He avoided the powerful light of the star and turned in a different direction. A bit of green vaguely sprouted in the void of that position. It rapidly enlarged in the center of the interface. It had a relatively distinct curved boundary. It was clearly a rapidly expanding planet in his field of vision, and it was brimming with the aura of life. It's like playing a game or watching a movie. Luo Nan couldn't find the feeling of being tested for a time. But it was a bit lacking to say that he was immersed in the scene. The immersive effect was not as good as virtual reality, and his sensory perception lacked real feedback. He knew very well that he was still on the yacht, transmitting information through space and waiting for the test question to appear. While he was pondering and studying, a series of data quickly popped up at the edge of the interface between the habitable planet and the void. The entire field of vision instantly turned into an information window similar to the cockpit. Visualized dynamic information was distributed in the field of vision in a complex and logically connected graphic pattern. From surface data to in-depth analysis indicators, everything was available. At least in Luo Nan's eyes, this was the case. A lot of the information was filled with symbols and units that he could not understand. They were profound and highly professional, beyond the scope of an intuitive translator like him. If it was a game, the newbie guide was really terrible, but this was a test, the kind that did not bode well. Luo Nan's scalp was a bit swollen. He was afraid that he would miss out on some important information. He opened his eyes wide and read the decipherable information of the memory information interface in one gulp. And during this process, his field of vision plunged into the atmosphere of the green planet in front of him. The feeling of a game or a movie came again. The image of the planet rotated at an unrealistic high speed, forming a fast-forward effect. At the same time, even more complex information, data, and corresponding analysis diagrams were flung out to the edge of his field of vision. Luo Nan couldn't keep watching. Luo Nan waited for the planet's rotation speed to return to normal with great difficulty. Just as he was about to catch his breath and reorganize the structure of information, his passive field of vision was instantly filled with a dynamic image of an explosion. It really was an explosion. What Luo Nan saw right now was a desperate battlefield. Successive explosions of intense light and raging flames tore apart the primordial greenery and burned half the sky red. Flying targets were shot down every second, and buildings on the ground were destroyed at the same time. Fatal flashes of light and impact crisscrossed between the sky and the ground. Though there was no sound input and it was like a pantomime, this was a war. And at this time, a mission window popped up in an eye-catching position on the cockpit management interface. Compared to the specialized interface that caused people to shrink back, the mission description was quite clear, a high-resolution satellite image locked onto the core region where the flames of war swirled. There was a large base called XX Relay Station. According to the introduction, the complex of buildings on the ground was only a small portion of the base. More facilities were still underground, and the core area was hidden in a special spacetime structure that was similar to a demiplane or a space vault. Luo Nan was able to understand this even though he guessed it. There were many introductions inside that touched upon more specialized domains. Luo Nan didn't understand half of it. The majority of the information he didn't understand was skipped. All in all, this base was extremely important. It possessed extremely high strategic value. Whether it was a movie, a game, or a test, all of this was necessary. It didn't hinder the understanding of the questions. Luo Nan carefully studied the key descriptions. The general meaning of the mission panel was, this was an important base sandwiched between 3 layers. The outermost layer was equipped with a XX defensive spacetime barrier. It served as a bunker against external enemies. It could be understood as some sort of enchantment. But right now, the enchantment was on the verge of collapse under the high intensity of the enemy's attacks. Luo Nan's test question was to take a step further in upgrading the defensive power of the relay station based on the situation of the battlefield and the enemy's strength. He didn't destroy the base's sandwiched 3-layer layout and retained the existing enchantment. The idea of the test was very clear. It was a test of Luo Nan's spacetime configuration design ability. This was a very appropriate test if the questions were examined correctly. Clearly, the Heaven's Stairway level of questions were on a completely different level from general knowledge application questions. The practical requirements were extremely high. It was already very close to actual combat. Luo Nan also discovered during the examination of the questions. Other than the intuitive interface of the cockpit management interface, he could also pull up various design blueprints of the base if he needed them. Geological structure diagrams, construction diagrams, and even the core planar configuration design were all there. Luo Nan skimmed a few glances. There were also all sorts of changes to the infrastructure and the dynamic losses of war. Everything was there. It was simply excessive. It formed a complete historical chain from the beginning of the base's construction all the way until now. Wasn't this test question designed according to actual combat examples? Perhaps there really did exist such a large-scale base at a certain time in the universe. There was such a war. There was such a node that required the contributions of a certain configuration designer. A sense of history assaulted his senses. Compared to this, the lack of authenticity in the senses was secondary. It was reasonable to say that any examinee would have nothing to say when the background information was given to this degree. All they needed to do was bury their heads in research. But Luo Nan, who had examined the questions twice, looked at the various data and charts that continuously refreshed on the cockpit management interface. He wanted to close his eyes and let out a long sigh. Perhaps the gentleman or lady who designed the test question had thought of everything. The only thing they hadn't considered was that the examinee participating in the test simply didn't possess the corresponding professional knowledge or even cultural background. Even if they did, they would probably only be able to hang around in the general knowledge circle. It was impossible for them to touch upon the heaven's stairway level of tests. Luo Nan was an exception. Once again, it was too professional. It was fine to just look at the basic layout and configuration design of the relay station. After all, Luo Nan had come into contact with a bit of a similar standard composition method in the virtual brain system. Combined with his solid foundational skills, he was able to delve into it with a vague understanding. He felt that he should know how to do it. It was just that he was unable to find a precise place to start in a short amount of time. But the problem was that the test question clearly stated that this test had to be viewed in conjunction with both sides of the offensive and defensive battle. Luo Nan was on the defensive side, and the external enemy occupied the offensive side. In other words, the enemy he needed to defend against. What the hell was that? There was a mist fortress that was as enormous as a mountain in the air. It was also an unfathomable mist fortress. Lightning interweaved within it as it expanded and contracted. Every time it flashed violently, it would spit out a swarm of bee-like monsters. Among them were air raiders that were similar to prehistoric pterosaurs. They spat exploding acid balls from their mouths. There were enormous rock monsters that were comparable to heavy cannons. They bombarded with death rays from dozens of kilometers away. There were beetle-like assault swarms that could burn parts of their bodies to forcefully break through boundaries and engage in close combat. And there was also the thing that extended out from the mist fortress. It was like a special tentacle. It was indistinct. It pierced through the ground and into the clouds. It could seize the base's facilities and energy at any time. It could even suck combat personnel dry. What was it? Actually, the test system had a label. Every time Luo Nan's attention was focused on an individual target, the cockpit interface would mark the target's basic information in the form of AR. However, Luo Nan was unable to understand the concise expression that was composed of professional symbols and measurement units. He looked over and over a few times, but he was only certain that these monsters seemed to be vassals of some fantasy breed. Could it be that it was all an illusion? Luo Nan understood. Luo Nan understood. In the eyes of the designer of the test question, the personnel participating in this test certainly possessed the basic knowledge to recognize this type of information. They could obtain comprehensive information from the interface as a reference. The more detailed information was certainly hidden behind professional words and symbols. Perhaps the difficulty of the test question would be completely controllable after integrating and analyzing all the information, but the reality was that Luo Nan didn't possess this kind of cultural background. The translation function of the secret text of the word "me" was limited. The information was all intermittent. Plus, the lack of the reality of the scene caused Luo Nan to only be able to use his sight to distinguish. His most proficient mental senses were completely useless. How was he supposed to take the test? Chapter 8:17. Luo Nan was a bit flustered. Could he exit right now and go back to rummage through the data of the virtual brain system to cram? Clearly, he could not. After the test questions were presented, a countdown began on the managed cockpit interface. Luo Nan was barely able to convert the basic time units of the mysterious civilization after doing a few simulations. From the pulsating rhythm of the scale, he could tell that he only had around 70 minutes of time. Luo Nan still remembered that the consequences of failing the offline test was that he would not be able to proceed with a second confirmation for a certain period of time. Luo Nan could only make blind guesses when it came to the measurement of a longer span of time. Months? Years? Or even longer? The more it was like this, the more he couldn't help but consider the most difficult aspects. Because of this, Luo Nan was exceptionally unable to accept the result of failure. Since he couldn't accept it and he couldn't change it, there was no point in lamenting and regretting. Luo Nan's ability to translate the secret text was basically like this. It was impossible to improve greatly in a short amount of time. Luo Nan could only do his utmost to decipher the information from the data and the images. The data was fine. Even if it was static and unable to reflect the changes in battle, Luo Nan would gain something from reading it a few more times. He would have more ideas. However, the analysis of the battle images was far too unreliable. Luo Nan's military knowledge was lacking. The only things he had were the basic knowledge he learned from Crag Burst. Moreover, this level of battle had long since surpassed the scope of Earth's military concepts. Luo Nan strove to look at the soldiers hidden within the various bunkers, facilities, and mobile vehicles of the base. They had humanoid appearances that Luo Nan naturally felt familiar with. Most of them wore extremely high-end exoskeleton armor. They were a bit similar to Deep Blue Walkers. Each and every one of them moved quickly, controlled stably, and were well trained. However, a considerable portion of their actions did not rely on the weapons in their hands to carry out direct attacks. Often, there would be some sudden, unforeseen attacks and defensive attacks that would erupt within and outside the base. They would appear above and below ground in various areas. At first glance, they didn't seem to conform to the laws of physics, but their destructive power was astonishingly great. This made Luo Nan think of the Deep Blue Walker's formatting domain. He thought of the Blood Intent Ring fortress that he had built with his own hands. He also thought of the Soul Order's so-called sanctuary. That's right. There was bound to be a clash and a gamble on the mental plane in this battle. If Luo Nan were to extrapolate from the current development direction of the Earth, then there would certainly be one or more collectivized, systemized, and solidified configurations on the mental plane that Luo Nan was unable to perceive. Of course, this was just a guess. No matter how powerful Luo Nan's soul strength was, no matter how high his mental senses were, it was hard for him to create something from nothing. He could probe the existence of the Sea of Consciousness and even the polar domain of the Abyss region from a simulated scene. He could only flip through the information. Now, not only did he have to look through the blueprints of buildings and wards, he also had to find blueprints of the soldiers' mental solidification. Unfortunately, there is none. It was still the same problem. The person who came up with the question would not consider things that had already become common knowledge. For an army that had already been established, its solidified configuration should have long since become common knowledge. There was no need to reflect it. However, this was already the only entry point that Luo Nan could exert his strength. Otherwise, what else could he do? The so-called fantasy breed vassal army that blotted out the sky and covered the earth outside of the base. These monsters hid their attacks on the invisible mental plane. There were truly no connections to follow. They became a natural moat that Luo Nan simply could not cross. Time passed minute by minute, second by second. Luo Nan bit his lips as he flipped through all the information he could understand. He did enormous and despairing calculations. Algorithms had never been Luo Nan's forte. When Luo Nan was forced to this step, it meant that he was truly at his wit's end. Dog's hit. It's all dog's hit. Luo Nan took nearly an hour to produce the embryonic form of 2 plans. However, they were pieced together results that made him feel nauseous. They were filled with untrustworthy conjectures and fantasies. He didn't even need to submit them. He just needed to do some mental calculations against the battle scenes to prove that they were all trash that could only be of help. He needed to throw them all into the trash bin. Information. Real-time information and information. I don't want anything else. I just want this. Luo Nan's taut strings of reason buzzed and trembled. He tried to find a thread of order that could resonate within the half-hidden sea of information. This was also a conflict between order and chaos. What Luo Nan was doing right now was a vast and exquisite balance that was presented by absolute hell and solar chakram of the abyss world. It was simply the distance between one end of the universe and the other. Wait a minute. Why did he suddenly think of that side? Luo Nan was distracted. His train of thought deviated for no reason. He was clearly struggling within the maelstrom of limited information and infinite chaos, but he inexplicably associated it with the abyss world. He associated it with the solar chakram and absolute hell, mutually conflicting and compromising structures. And it was extraordinarily clear. It was as if it was right before his eyes. Last time, he was in such a state. What followed next was a backlash plus heavy injuries. Luo Nan shuddered. The disadvantages of the non-immersive environment were apparent. He popped out from his focused state and instinctively inspected the state of his body and soul. His body was fine on the yacht. The tree-hole space was still stable at the forefront of his thoughts. Then, the countdown of the administrative cockpit entered a warning orange-yellow zone at this moment. It reminded Luo Nan that the time for him to hand in his test paper was getting closer and closer. Luo Nan gritted his teeth. What was he thinking about? He wouldn't die anyway. At worst, he would just make a trip to Claw Island and update himself. And if he failed this test, he would be unable to increase his privileges. It would be difficult to obtain the encrypted information of the external neuron. The impact was secondary. What was truly unacceptable was that he would miss the window to approach the truth. He would have to start another round of unpredictable waiting. He had to choose the lesser of two evils. If the special image of the abyss world could stir the current deadlock, then there was nothing bad about it. Well, it was impossible for Luo Nan to pin his hopes on another unpredictable factor. He needed to maintain his focus first. Luo Nan slapped his cheeks heavily with both hands and forced himself to dispel all distracting thoughts. He placed his attention back on the virtual war. The information was still as chaotic as before. His agitation and anxiety were still there. But before he knew it, the heat in his emotions and the coldness in his will gradually formed a subtle state of conflict and compromise, just like the conflict between Sunwheel and Hell, and the conflict between the images of high temperature and chains. Between rules and chaos, between reason and emotion, a noose of chains was erected. It endlessly churned and cleansed, maintaining a dangerous yet marvelous dynamic balance. His mind moved and didn't move. It was sharp and clear. The information moved and didn't move. There was order in the chaos. The most important thing was that Luo Nan suddenly discovered a marvelous phenomenon of mapping from the non-immersive test scene. What he saw in his eyes was still the half-cut information that made him restless. There was no sign of things turning for the better even now. It was impossible for the offline test system to provide deeper information. But there was an inexplicable sense of déjà vu. There were some impressions buried deep within his memories that were stimulated by this chaotic information, slowly emerging. Of course, this was an illusion. The true reason was that there was an even deeper and grander system right next to him in a position that was infinitely close. It was in a completely different state from its previous unfathomable and uncontrollable state. It established a connection with the offline test system and began the orderly output of information and data. The abyss world. To be more precise, it was the sediment that Luo Nan was unable to absorb and digest when he suffered the backlash of the abyss world. It accumulated within the altar spiderweb. In a certain sense, this sediment was equivalent to Luo Nan's own memories. It was just that it was hidden deep within an external storage system that was more complex than the brain. It was simply impossible to dig it out in the past. But now, it was activated. The management cockpit continued to pop out analytic graphics without end. Luo Nan continued to not understand the characters he should not understand. But Luo Nan was no longer looking at these scribbles. His gaze fell directly on the panoramic battlefield. It fell on the buildings, the soldiers, and the vassal groups or individuals of the fantasy breed. An even more intense feeling of familiarity burst forth. The old-style defensive array. What was it called? I don't remember, but as a solidified configuration, it should look like this. Magnetite mica. This sort of thing is a large-scale soul magnetization storm of soldiers. Pure defense is definitely not enough. I have to take the initiative to interfere. The design of the enchantment. Crap. I don't have enough time. The timer on the management cockpit entered the red zone. Luo Nan no longer had the chance to carefully comb through it. However, the experience he obtained from the entire battlefield told him that there was no need to worry. This so-called test was nothing more than a seamless connection between many different types of spacetime structures, seeking a stable and optimal solution. Of course Luo Nan knew this. During his battle with Gong Chi a few days ago, especially in the cavern of the blood god ants, the mist labyrinth, the blood soul temple, and other domain structures interweaved and mixed together to firmly seal Gong Chi within. This was something that had been tested in practice. The structure of the relay station in the topic was a defensive facility. The tightness of the structure was indeed much higher than that of the structures mentioned above. But it was precisely because of its tightness and regularity that the difficulty of Luo Nan's test was actually a bit lower. Beep. Test time is up. The scene before Luo Nan's eyes suddenly turned dark. The scribbles on the management cockpit were cleared out. His last impression of the battlefield stopped at the outer perimeter of the relay station. It was the instant the firestorm exploded. The living planets and the model-like stars all disappeared into the distance. Luo Nan's thoughts returned to the virtual brain interface. A notification pop-up window appeared once more, announcing the test results. This kind of information was quite easy to understand. XX simulation combat test completed. System evaluation, a competent professional. The military's attitude toward you is quite conservative. But blood and fire will help you grow rapidly or die quickly. What kind of score was this? Luckily, the true test results came out. Additional questions offline test result, pass. Realization of Heaven's Stairway waiting. The waiting score is incorporated into the general knowledge test result. Applicable to the 100-year sequence special talent clause. Knowledge access level increased. Confirmation of rights review complete. Rank determination complete. Holders current privileges, ownership, temporary. Knowledge access, Heaven's Stairway level 4, tested. Resource access, sergeant rank, tested. Heaven Abyss network, none, not connected. Opening corresponding privileges to the database. Able to extract design and craft data of lamination interference. Chapter 8:18. It really wasn't easy. The virtual brain system still remembered this young master's original goal. Luo Nan was a bit stupefied by the series of evaluations and results. He only came back to his senses when he saw the last sentence. He subconsciously let out a sigh of relief. But when he thought about it in detail, he felt a bit unbalanced in his heart. Of the 4 main authorizations, the Heavenly Abyss network had been disconnected and could be ignored. The remaining 3, knowledge search and resource transfer, had changed from pending detection to detected. Among them, knowledge search had also been upgraded to Celestial Stairway level 4. He did a set of Heaven's Stairway level 2 tests and obtained the right to check out Heaven's Stairway level 4. It looked pretty good. Bullshit. The core of the test, ownership, didn't change at all from the word to the meaning. He had been tossing and turning for so long, but in the end, he was still a temporary owner. Someone could point at his nose and tell him to return the item to its rightful owner at any time? What was the use of this sort of confirmation and review process? Luo Nan cut a sorry figure during the offline test and finally obtained this kind of result. Luo Nan was quite vexed. However, Luo Nan was a good and reasonable child in nature. He knew how to look for reasons from himself for everything. After calming down for a bit, he thought back to the entire test process. It really wasn't all that amazing. The final evaluation he obtained was quite conservative. Reality was reality. No matter what objective factors existed, the test evaluation had its own preset standards. Luo Nan was unable to reason with the system. Oh, my head hurts. Luo Nan's mental and physical state began to slide into a low ebb. His results from the low-altitude sweep were just one of the factors. A considerable portion originated from the life-saving mapping during the test. This could be considered a kind of backlash. The amount of information from the sediment was quite large in an instant. Fortunately, it had been washed by the altar spiderweb, so it was easier to digest than the direct impact of the abyss world. Luo Nan was a bit regretful. The mapping that was activated during the test formed mostly instant memories. Now that he thought about it, there wasn't much that he could remember. It was a bit like forcefully memorizing a question to pass the test. He had to memorize it in one gulp. He had to come to the question, the situation, and the conditions before he could think of the answer. After the test, everything returned to square one. The sediment continued to precipitate. Perhaps it was waiting for the next stimulus to arrive. After Luo Nan discovered this, he was unable to inspect his spoils of war. He hurriedly retracted the external neuron and opened up the virtual workspace on the yacht. He took stock of the little bit of memory information that remained. Over half an hour passed. Luo Nan's head was dizzy and swollen. He looked at the work area again, but the results were few and far between. The relay station was still all right. He had studied the blueprints seriously and had some general ideas. As for the fantasy breed, it was just a fleeting thought. Luo Nan let out a long and sorrowful sigh. In this way, it would be difficult for him to do a review. In other words, he didn't even know where he went wrong. Luo Nan's obsessive-compulsive disorder flared up. He competed with himself, tossing and turning in the virtual work area until he was exhausted, but he still didn't make any progress. He had been offline for over an hour. That was about the same amount of time he had spent tormenting himself. Unknowingly, it was already dinner time. Snake Tongue carried a dinner plate and quietly walked in. Luo Nan came to a realization when he saw Snake Tongue's familiar face. The muslin of concealment was still attached to his body. He had yet to return it to Snake Tongue. Also, the data on the stacking interference technique, which had given rise to all of this, was still lying idle in the external neurons database, waiting for him to read it. What a digression. Luo Nan mocked himself, but things were already like this. He wasn't in a hurry. He saw that the portion on the dinner plate wasn't much, but it looked like the exquisite dishes of Ban City. He really was hungry. He didn't wait for Snake Tongue to finish arranging the food on the plate. He first grabbed a piece of sushi and stuffed it into his mouth. Honestly speaking, he didn't taste much, but the rice ball was quickly digested after entering his stomach. There was a warm and harmonious energy circulating in his stomach. He enjoyed it greatly. It felt similar to the special ingredients of the Xia City branch. It was a nourishing food specially prepared for ability users, but its effects were quite smooth. It was just right for Luo Nan's current situation. This isn't bad, Luo Nan praised. He asked in passing, is it suitable for non-ability users to eat? Snake Tongue sat upright in her seat and responded softly, rice is a specialty of Ban City's normal trade market. There are indeed health-preserving products specially supplied to the LRCF investment circle. That's good. I'll be bringing some back to Xia City. Yeah. Snake Tongue bowed in response. She still had a humble and submissive appearance, but perhaps it was because she lacked the disguising effect of the musket of invisibility. She felt that there was a bit more hidden sharpness to her than when she was in Northmont Shuahui's state. Especially when she lowered her head. The shadows cast by the lamplight just so happened to decorate the lines of her brows and eyes, highlighting her dark and sharp qualities. But it also made her docile and submissive, making her particularly valuable. Of course, this was for Luo Nan. Luo Nan's mood suddenly turned for the better by quite a bit. This person, his former enemy, was now his submissive servant. She was clearly a vicious character with a heart like a snake or scorpion, but she was forced to act like this in front of him. Even though she still had pride and schemes deep within her heart, she was like ice shards during the dog days of summer. She couldn't show her face. She couldn't see the light. Luo Nan could easily knead and knead her as he pleased. He could mobilize her joy and fear. He could dictate her life and death. He could browse through every hidden detail. He could even casually smear on them to see a new round of reactions and transformations. Snake Tongue could only passively adapt until she became accustomed to it. Or she could make changes that Luo Nan permitted. She had already done quite well. After the conversation in the bathroom, her corrections were very clear. She knew better than to look at the problems on the psychological level. She certainly still had some unwillingness in the depths of her heart. Her unruliness was still there. Her lofty and unyielding character still existed. The more it was like this, the more painful it was, but she was able to obtain an unending stream of strength from it. She still lacked a bit of conscious self-awareness up until now, as well as a method to efficiently utilize it. So much so that she had suffered a lot of torment for no reason. Luo Nan was unable to help her with this. Frankly speaking, he was quite pleased to see Snake Tongue struggle. Cough. Luo Nan was a bit unaccustomed to suddenly digging out the dark side of his heart. But in this sort of one-sided situation, there was a marvelous calmness that came from letting oneself fly. In any case, his mood had indeed turned for the better. He removed the veil of invisibility from his face and handed it back to Snake Tongue. He even made a joke in passing, "Your acting skills were all trained on Northmont Shuahui, right?" Luo Nan laughed out loud during Snake Tongue's momentary stillness. He pulled out the information related to the lamination interference technology from the virtual brain system. The information wasn't a huge tome, but its form was quite interesting. It was similar to the amalgamation of an experimental diary and a thesis draft. It was a bit messy for other people, but Luo Nan had a solid foundation in configuration. He also had the mindset of a researcher. The entire research train of thought was simply moved before his eyes. Even though there were a few uncommon characters inside that he was unable to recognize and translate, it didn't affect the overall situation. Compared to the experience of the offline test, it was simply the difference between heaven and earth. Luo Nan skimmed through the information and had a preliminary understanding of the context of the entire information. He also quickly grasped the crux of a problem. He raised his eyes and saw that Snake Tongue was just about to leave the room. He shouted, "Wait!" Snake Tongue was already Northmont Shuahui. She raised her head in a slight daze. Her face was even colder and purer than her original appearance. It intersected with her sinister and malicious image from before, forming a rather large visual impact. Luo Nan was stunned for a moment before he said, "Stay here. Help me with some experiments." Yeah. According to the information, the veil of concealment and the veil of silence weren't the carriers of the spirit core for lamination interference technology. Instead, they were just extensions. They weren't made of natural materials, nor did they go through any special processing techniques. They were just true lamination interference spirit cores. They were in a semi-energized state, absorbing the energy of the outside world over the years to carry out the transformation of mass and energy. They were paired with a small portion of special raw materials to weave themselves into strange objects. According to the information, Mr. Liang Lu's original intention in creating the spirit core was to conceal his identity. Therefore, the combat power of the entire set of objects wasn't that great. This was especially true for the transformation and interference axis of the spirit core itself. It was precise and relatively fragile. It would often disintegrate in battle, and it couldn't be mass-produced. It could only be made according to the specific state of the lamination layer and the user's situation. It was a test of thought and skill. Liang Lu's self-evaluation also said that the relevant design ideas and techniques were actually a level higher than the evaluation of the work. However, the repeatability of the spirit core was far too poor, so it could only reach the 4th level of the celestial stairway. It was a step away from the title of nobility. It was quite regretful that he couldn't leave his name in the annals of history. Luo Nan didn't quite understand the background of this technology, but he did understand one thing: the product of lamination interference spirit core was a top-notch concealment equipment. If it was operated properly, the user could even change their characteristics in the mental domain, becoming a completely different person. This kind of ability was seriously overflowing. Wouldn't it be too wasteful to use it purely for concealment? The information also said that as a derivative of the spirit core, the dual muslin and the frame of the body and soul must be highly integrated. Otherwise, the interweaving and changing power would injure the user first. This set a very high requirement for the changes, matching, and blending of the user's body and soul structure. The most interesting thing was that the information wasn't limited to the simple pairing of one person and one object. Instead, it was placed on a broader societal level. It researched how to make the characteristics formed by lamination interference approach what kind of person, what kind of person, what kind of standpoint, what kind of person, and what kind of person's faith. This was done in order to obtain the approval of the corresponding circles, to eliminate their vigilance and killing intent. It was simply a teaching syllabus for the study of disguise. Luo Nan had yet to formally begin, but he already felt that he had learned a lot. At the very least, he knew that the extraterrestrial civilization that Mr. Liang Lu resided in was a complex and turbulent society that could be labeled as a heretic at any time. Luo Nan also noticed that the information clearly involved the mutual interference of the body and soul, but there wasn't a single word or sentence that involved the words soul strength, mental plane, and the like. The corresponding concepts were all replaced with things like material waves, thought waves, and so on. Translated, this was the meaning. The smell was a bit familiar, Dean Wan. Wasn't this the concept that Dean Wan's order of creation had always emphasized? Chapter 8:19. Hua Dian was the unluckiest person in the world. At least in the 10 days after the 28th of April, Hua Dian firmly believed so. Under the bastard horn demon's terrible ability to control the situation, a routine business investigation suddenly turned into a swing on the line between life and death. The messy arrangements, the baffling traps, the sudden infighting. There were also two almighty extraordinaries who had come from thousands of miles away to attach their souls to him. By the time Hua Dian snapped to his senses, he had already been held hostage in the wilderness laboratory and stayed there for 10 days. 10 days was a very long period of time, especially when there was a lack of water and food. Even a superpower would be done for. Hua Dian was glad that every time he went out on a mission, he would prepare emergency energy bars and water replenishment capsules. Over the past few days, he had been frugal and meticulous with his plans. He had finally managed to survive. As for the others, he had to say that apart from him, there was no normal person in the laboratory. Ignoring the two who were possessed by extraordinary souls, Jingxin and Horned Demon were two dogs in front of a true god. They could live by the whims of others and couldn't be judged by common sense. As for the remaining two, Hua Dian originally wanted to find a sense of superiority. At the very least, he wanted to experience the feeling of being in the same boat. However, the reality dealt him a heavy blow. Saint Anthony probably didn't prepare enough supplies and ran out of food a week ago. However, he had relied on the pure and rich holy light in his body to mutate and adjust his organs. He entered a state of ascetic cultivation and endured it day by day. Although he was nearly 2 times thinner than before he came in, he was still in high spirits without any signs of fatigue. His mind was even clearer. The one with the surname One walked around the laboratory every day, constantly gesturing with his composition. If he was tired, he could squeeze out water from the air to replenish his energy. The more Hua Dian saw, the more she suspected that this guy's mouth could automatically produce liquid food and the like, so that he would never have to worry about food shortages. Against these two, be it in terms of willpower or ability, Hua Dian had no choice but to admit defeat. Worst of all, they were silent fellows. They wouldn't say anything for 2 to 3 days, so there was no way for them to communicate. It bored Hua Dian to death. Perhaps he was only suitable to be a commercial spy. However, it was precisely in such an environment that Hua Dian's sense of crisis was increasing day by day under the encirclement of these people. The big fish ate the small fish, and the small fish ate the shrimps. This was the ecology of the inner world. He wasn't willing to be someone's dog, and his abilities were a notch lower than others. Once he caused trouble, the outcome that awaited him would most likely not be too good. I have to leave. I have to leave quickly. From the first day he entered the laboratory, Hua Dian had never given up on this idea. He had even thought of more than a dozen plans, but none of them were feasible. The regular way in and out of the laboratory was in the hands of Luo Yuan. He had been very easygoing from beginning to end, as if he were there to watch the fun. The question of whether or not to leave the laboratory was completely controlled by the true God. As for the true God, this Almighty who could summon the wind and summon the rain outside, he was willing to stay in this small laboratory because he wanted to dig out the mystery within. At least before the East Ocean auction was held on May 16th, he didn't want to waste a single second. Leave? How could this be? Moreover, Luo Yuan had been saying with a smile that the void environment of the laboratory was unstable. Everyone could be left behind at any time, and it would not be so easy to come in again. Every time he said this, Hua Dian wanted to punch him. He must have done it on purpose, to deliberately provoke him. With the mentality of the true God, the more he heard such words, the less likely it was to leave easily. However, the fact was that they had been here for 10 days, and the entire laboratory was like a small bunker with 1,000 piles. It couldn't be more stable. Even if the sudden storm passed through 2 days ago, causing a certain amount of impact damage to the 2 Kelliser-shaped corridors of the laboratory, the main body of the laboratory was as stable as Mount Tai. Not stable at all. But it was also after that storm that the intensity of the true God's experiment suddenly increased to a level. As the key area of the experiment, the observation hall, Hua Dian no longer dared to approach. The safest thing to do now was to find a room that had not been eroded by the sandstorm and hide in it. But Hua Dian was the kind of person who couldn't stay idle. Just now, he followed Wan Ta and strolled in the right Kelliser-shaped corridor for a while. In comparison, this man, who was said to be a welfare dean in the secular world, was relatively easy to talk to. In particular, some of the outlines he drew often involved the structure of the laboratory, and perhaps the analysis of the sandstorm outside. Hua Dian quietly recorded it, ready to go out, as his own harvest, to extort more money from the employer. Wan Ta should be able to detect his behavior of secretly photographing, but he did not stop it, so Hua Dian took it as his acquiescence. After some photographing and collecting, Wan Ta closed his eyes and rested there, adjusting his thoughts. Hua Dian went up to chat with him for a while, but he didn't get the point, so he retreated and walked back along the corridor. Just as he was thinking about where to go, his scalp suddenly went numb. The sound of heavy footsteps came from the front. Because of the curvature, he couldn't see the appearance of the person coming, but his mind had automatically imagined the seemingly sluggish body of the fat dragon. The true God. For 10 days, the true God had been sending his soul to this loyal believer, leading everything in the laboratory. It could be said that he controlled everyone's life and death apart from Luo Yuan. Hua Dian instinctively didn't wish to meet this person. He turned his gaze and saw that the door to a room in front of him was ajar. It hadn't been eroded by the sandstorm. Without thinking too much, he plunged into the room. When he entered, he suddenly thought of a problem. According to the latest popular cage theory, by the time he discovered the true God, he would probably have been in and out several times. Why bother? Hua Dian froze at the door as Fat Dragon's body slowly walked past him. He didn't even turn his head, ignoring Hua Dian's existence. Instead, it was Jingxin, who was following behind, who shot a glance over and bared his teeth in amusement, looking very amiable. Damn, simp. Hua Dian didn't have a good impression of Jingxin. This wilderness ecology expert who held a post in the Ability User Association had really embarrassed all the technicians in the world. However, he was still somewhat curious. After the two of them walked over, he even poked his head out to take a look. However, due to the curvature of the corridor, he couldn't see the end. He didn't dare go forward either. After poking his head out a few times, he gave up. It was also at this moment that Hua Dian suddenly felt that something was amiss. He turned his head and saw that in the corner of the empty room, there was someone sitting on the ground with his back against the wall. He didn't seem to have any energy at all. He was like a lump of meat that had been kneaded and thrown there. The lump of meat could still move. Its only arms slid around the ground and walls as it searched. Sometimes, it would use its nails to forcefully dig out some powder and place it in front of its eyes. Finally, it would lick it with its tongue or even swallow it. Ugh! Only a horned demon could do such a disgusting thing. Although Horned Demon and Jingxin were the two dogs under the true God's feet, there was actually a difference between dogs. Jingxin was a very competent bootlicker. His only job every day was to serve the true god well. As for the centaur, the initiator of the current situation, after losing an arm, his temperament became more and more weird and gloomy. He did some weird behavior that others couldn't understand. It was appropriate to call him a mad dog. Regardless of what he thought, he had to maintain his dignity. Hua Dian tried his best to ignore horned demons in human actions. The corner of his mouth twitched as he revealed a smile. Sorry, I didn't know there was someone here. Sorry to disturb you. Something's wrong. Horned demon's hoarse and dry voice sounded. There were only 2 people in the room, so it was impossible for Hua Dian to pretend that it was a misunderstanding. He could only turn his head. What? I'm not in the right state. Nonsense. Believe it or not, my anus can see it. Hua Dian knew that horned demon was messing around again. In the past few days, similar situations had happened to him more than once or twice. It was most likely due to the stimulation he received before entering the laboratory that he couldn't resolve. The 2 transcendents watched coldly, so it was impossible for Hua Dian to get involved. He was only thinking that he might suddenly be bitten if he was in the same room as horned demon. Hua Dian had the intention to retreat, so he said with a fake smile, "You're still too tired. Rest a little longer. I won't disturb you." With that said, he turned around and left regardless of horned demon's reaction. To his surprise, the moment the door opened, he nearly bumped into someone's face again. Holy sh*t, Dr. Jingxin? Jingxin, who had just passed by, was standing outside the door. He was still smiling and looking very friendly. Looking for horned demon? He's inside. Hua Dian didn't want to deal with such a person at all. He nodded and smiled before turning to the side to walk out. However, Jingxin didn't make way for him. It was also at this moment that horned demon, who was sitting on the ground, let out a long sigh. He slowly got up and walked over, saying strange words that no one could understand. That's how it should be. At this moment, Hua Dian was in no mood to decipher it. As a B-rank ability user, the distance between him and Jingxin had seriously exceeded the normal safe distance. If they happened to meet, it wouldn't be a problem for them to cross paths instantly. However, Jingxin stood there without any intention of making way. Then, the words that came out of his mouth made Hua Dian's heart sink. Brother Hua Dian, Lord True God invites you over. I'm not going. That was Hua Dian's first reaction, but he didn't have the courage to say those simple words. In that instant, the horned demon behind him swayed as he followed, forming a pincer attack with Jingxin. Furthermore, in the air that he couldn't see or sense clearly, there might be a pair of invisible eyes coldly watching him. Hua Dian gulped a mouthful of saliva. The effects of the rejuvenation capsule seemed to have passed. His throat was so dry that he even cracked his first voice. Okay. Okay. Chapter 820. Hua Dian hated that the corridor was too short. Before he could sort out the situation in his shocked brain, Fatty Dragon's back was already in front of him. The only thing that comforted him was that he had just remembered that Wan Ta was also here. He had been pondering over the composition at the end of the corridor all this time. If a true god came, the 2 sides would definitely bump into each other. Hua Dian then realized that there were already 5 people gathered at the end of the corridor. Aside from Luo Yuan and Anthony, everyone else in the laboratory was here. The true god was in charge of everything, and the focus was. Hua Dian's eyelids twitched. The further he got from the end of the corridor, the worse he felt. A slight flow of air that shouldn't have appeared brushed past his cheeks, evoking a certain memory in the depths of his heart. He subconsciously turned his left wrist, but he still felt that it wasn't enough. He used his other hand to touch it, but all he felt was skin, flesh, and bone. 10 days ago, when he first arrived at the laboratory, there was a wristwatch on it. It was just that the guide, Luo Yuan, took it off and threw it into. Hua Dian stopped. The true god and Wanta were conversing in front of him. The effect is okay, right? It didn't completely block the infiltration. The storm 2 days ago caused some changes in the environment. It's fine as long as it's more or less useful. We can adjust and correct it later. The effect isn't obvious. Let's verify it first, then come to a conclusion. I see that you've been researching for the past few days. You came from Xia City. You and Luo Nan often communicate on composition design? Very little. Our communication is more on the use of the brain and the construction of thought and logic. Your relationship isn't bad, huh? It is. From Hua Dian's point of view, the conversation between the two seemed to be spontaneous and flowed naturally, but there was tension and coldness seeping through it. If Hua Dian was purely a bystander, he would be happy to analyze it in detail. But right now, Jingxin was staring at him with a fake smile, forcing him to move forward. Hua Dian's heart was filled with ominous clouds. Up ahead, at the end of the corridor, there was an even more eye-catching scene aside from the two conversing. The metal door that led to the so-called tree hole was open. Hua Dian felt his scalp tingle as he subconsciously retreated. Jingxin coughed beside him, wanting to warn him. At this time, Fat Dragon had already turned around. His face was stiff, but his eyes shone with the brilliance of a true god. When the bright light shone on him, Hua Dian's body froze on the spot, motionless. Something's not right. The centaur on the other side was confused again. As he muttered, he picked some powder from the wall of the corridor next to him. This time, he didn't lick it into his mouth, but he held it in front of his eyes in a daze. Shut up. The true god's gaze was still on Hua Dian. He only used Fat Dragon's mouth to reprimand the centaur. The centaur didn't react, but he stopped talking. The true god did not play any tricks and immediately said to Hua, "You, go to the door." When she heard this order, Hua Dian was already a little desensitized. Her emotions were in a mess, but her mind was surprisingly clear. The big fish ate the small fish, and the small fish ate the shrimp. They were finally going to make their move. Then, fear surged in his heart. Hey, there's no need to make a fuss. Beside him, Jingxin slapped him on the shoulder and interrupted him. He even took on an unprecedentedly intimate attitude. It's just an experiment, just my ass. Hua Dian instinctively reacted and wanted to elbow back. However, just as this instinct was about to be triggered, it froze under the true god's cold gaze. Jingxin was certain that Hua Dian had already lost his resistance. He casually hugged Hua Dian's stiff shoulders and persuaded him like a good buddy, "Calm down. You cannot believe in your strength and luck, but you can't doubt His Excellency's abilities. Look, we've already made sufficient preparations here. All you need to do is verify it. Walk in and walk out. It's that simple." Perhaps because he hadn't spoken to his heart's content in a long time, Jingxin's chatterbox trait seemed to be on the verge of erupting. "Don't ask why we aren't going. Everyone will understand. Besides, you're the only professional spy here. Come, use your specialty. Go to that tree hole and observe carefully. Tell His Excellency the results. As for the remuneration, it will definitely be enough." His incessant chatter finally attracted the true god's gaze. Jingxin's voice came to an abrupt halt, afraid that he would incur the true god's displeasure and enter the tree hole exploration list at the last minute. He began carrying out his true mission. He grabbed the back of Hua Dian's neck and hooked him forward with all his might. "What you're doing is too much." Wan Ta's voice sounded beside Fat Dragon. The true god's reaction was calm. "Say something useful. After a living being enters the tree hole, you need to know the effects it will cause and how to adjust." In his heart, Wan Ta was a technician who could help him. However, Wan Ta's reaction was even more direct. He turned around and walked away, arriving beside Hua Dian in 2 steps. In passing, he smacked Jingxin's arm away. The latter never expected such a situation to occur as his arm slipped from Hua Dian's shoulder. Wan Ta gestured to Hua Dian. "Let's go." Hua Dian stood motionless, his mind still in a daze. Jingxin's eyes nearly popped out as he bellowed, "Who dares move?" Wanta reached out to grab Hua Dian's arm and continued forward. Hua Dian finally snapped to his senses. His aura, which had been repressed by the true god, came to life as he began exerting strength from his feet. But at that moment, he clearly saw Fat Dragon's muscular body distort at the end of the corridor. In fact, what was being distorted was the air and perception. Then, the distorting force was used on Hua Dian and Wanta. A muffled explosion sounded in the corridor as Wanta's body slammed into the wall. The back of Hua Dian's head hit the ground. Even Jingxin was pushed 3 to 5 meters away as he slammed into the curved corner of the corridor. On the other hand, the horned demon didn't care about what happened here. He headed straight for the true god and happened to avoid the frontal assault. At that moment, he stopped and turned his head curiously. No matter what, Hua Dian was still a B rank. His previous reaction wasn't up to standard, mainly because he was being suppressed by the true god. Now that he had hit his head on the ground, he was completely clear-headed. It was time to risk his life. The few plans that he had been pondering over the past few days flashed through his mind, but in the end, he reacted instinctively. He exerted strength in his legs and shoulders at the same time, his body sticking close to the ground as he slid backward at high speeds. Soft sounds of sonic booms rang out as 7 bone talismans shot into the air. These bone talismans were said to be props made by a certain transcendent. After Hua Dian bought them at a high price, he had been keeping them close to his body. Every time he used one, he would feel the heartache for days. But now, he was throwing them out as though they were free. High frequency, high pressure, and highly chaotic impacts exploded one after another. The external physical impact was secondary. A considerable portion of it was used on the mental level. It connected to the illusory abyss to summon a storm with greater destructive power. Whoosh! It was as though a gale had passed through the corridor, emitting a muffled howl that caused one's blood to sink. Some of these bone talismans killed indiscriminately. Hua Dian was also affected, so he couldn't figure out the changes in the outside world. He didn't hope to injure the true god. All he wanted was to cause the laboratory space to tremble. Also, according to his observations over the past few days, there was an area similar to the one that swallowed his wristwatch, past the corner, the second door. I'll take a gamble. Hua Dian had already slid past Jingxin. The latter was struck by the abyss storm summoned by the bone talisman. His reaction was a beat too slow, preventing him from intercepting him. Hua Dian's shoulder brushed against the corner wall, but he didn't slow down at all. The locked door was right in front of him. His heart stirred, and just as he was about to jump up, his chest suddenly felt stuffy and hot. Then, there was a muffled sound of his sternum collapsing. As though he had been trampled by an invisible elephant, Hua Dian's sliding body was suddenly nailed to the spot. Apart from his twitching hands and feet, there was no other movement. Stupidity can be contagious, but life can't be shared. The tremors caused by the bone talisman were rapidly dispersed. After a moment of chaos, the true gods will suppress the entire space like a resplendent sun. The power and order that belonged to him forcefully interfered with the surrounding area, gathering into an invisible cage that trapped the heavily injured Hua Dian. It also trapped Wanta and continued compressing the space. Wanta didn't wait for death. He arched his body slightly and gathered his arms in front of his chest, assuming a defensive posture. His mouth opened and closed slightly, but no sound could be heard. However, invisible waves were emitted, causing the surrounding space to tremble incessantly. It resisted the cage cast by the true god. Affected by this, the corridor clearly buzzed and trembled. At that moment, Jingxin snapped back to his senses from the impact of the bone talisman. Compared to the instant chaos created by Hua Dian, he was even more surprised that Wanta could enter a stalemate with the power cast by the true god. Even if they were separated by thousands of kilometers, the true god's power would definitely be greatly weakened. Furthermore, He hadn't activated the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure or used any divine powers. However, in this face-to-face struggle, the true god's perfect and harmonious power structure naturally had a level suppression. Hua Dian's outcome was proof. How did Wanta manage to persevere to this point? The true god was most likely surprised as well. He urged Fat Dragon to speak, giving treatment that far exceeded Hua Dian's. I understand the so-called bad temper of the technicians. I don't mind giving you a chance to explain. Wanta's lips opened slightly wider. It's easier for me to explain to the children this way. It's beneficial for moral education. The true god didn't speak again. However, the fat dragon he possessed had ferocious patterns on its plain and fleshy face. Together with the brilliant divine light in its eyes, they formed a perfect representation of his emotions. At that moment, footsteps approached. The commotion in the right corridor couldn't be hidden from others. Anthony and Luo Yuan, who were in other parts of the laboratory, arrived one after another. Anthony arrived first. He walked to Hua Dian's side and didn't say a word when he saw this. He squatted down and pressed his palm on Hua Dian's chest. A mercury-like glow descended, stimulating the activity of his organs and temporarily alleviating the heavy injuries in his chest and abdomen. Luo Yuan was the last to arrive. He walked slowly and even limped a little. He had been like this for 2 or 3 days. It was said that the carrier he had attached his soul to had exhausted its potential, and the genetic level had begun to collapse. In any case, it was only a temporary item, so Luo Yuan didn't care. He also stopped beside Hua Dian and looked at the scene in the corridor. He sighed softly. This scene. The 7 of them gathered together again, and the atmosphere was terrible. Under Anthony's treatment, Hua Dian's consciousness recovered. He knew that only Luo Yuan, who was also an extraordinary, was qualified to adjust the situation. He wanted to ask for help, but the blood in his throat surged up first. It gurgled and drowned out his voice. Anthony frowned and exerted a little more strength. Hua Dian coughed out another mouthful of blood and stared at Luo Yuan. All his words converged into the most primitive word, help. Luo Yuan shook his head slightly and didn't give a response. He only sighed with emotion. It's already not bad that it can last until now. It's very normal now. The true god opposite him directly refuted. At that moment, everything in the laboratory was under his control. He slowly compressed Myriad Pagoda's defensive space and gradually erased the possibility of its rebound. At the same time, he gestured to Jingxin, who was at the corner of the arc, to bring Hua Dian over. Finally, he spoke in a warning tone, everything is under control. Control my ass. A voice that sounded a little out of tune exploded next to Fat Dragon, who was controlled by the true god. A step earlier than the sound wave, a heavy kick aimed straight at Fat Dragon's waist. Before the true god's emotions could be completely projected onto Fat Dragon's face, his body had already left the ground. He smashed through the open door behind him and fell into the half-destroyed tree hole. A muffled explosion sounded, and the void trembled. Chapter 8:21. The scene in front of him went from light to darkness, then from darkness to light, from the distorted laboratory environment to the illogical sandstorm fragments, then to the familiar sky and land. Finally, there were turbid water waves and bitter liquid that poured into his mouth and nose. Hua Dian floated in the water. His chest and abdomen seemed to have been splashed with sulfuric acid. He was in so much pain that his hands and feet twitched. He couldn't stop coughing, bringing out the blood in his lungs and salty water in his esophagus and trachea. The current pain, as well as the possible fatal infection and injury that followed, consumed most of his energy. His mind was also in a mess, but as long as the last scene in the laboratory continued to flash in his mind, Hua Dian's future days could be lived with a smile. Awesome, it's awesome. To think that a true god would have such a day. At that moment, the true god and Fat Dragon, whose soul was attached to them, were kicked into the tree hole's ruins by the crazy horn demon. As it turned out, Jingxin's words couldn't be trusted at all. What adequate preparation? It was just a pile of dog shit. At that moment, the true god personally swallowed it. Ayaya, to think that fat dragon was in between. What a pity. Of course, it was impossible for the true god to swallow his **T. The moment he fell into the tree hole or even the sandstorm, a mental storm erupted and swept through the entire laboratory. The scene of Luo Yuan's prophecy came as scheduled. The void structure of the laboratory was distorted and leaking everywhere. A large number of cracks expelled everyone present into the unfathomable void crevice. Huadian still remembered that Luo Yuan had mentioned a few unlucky people who shared the same fate as him. From the current situation, he was considered one of the luckier ones among his kind. After being ejected from the laboratory, he followed an incomprehensible tunnel and passed through the void barrier, returning to the familiar Earth space-time. Furthermore, he fell into a plateau saltwater lake, reducing the impact. There was no need to consider radiation pollution for the time being. Bam! There was a dull sound of water beside him. Someone was a step behind Huadian and crashed into the saltwater lake. They quickly discovered him and reached out to pull him up by the shoulder. Huadian was shocked at first, but when he rolled his eyes and barely recognized the person's silhouette, he relaxed and complained vaguely, "You almost killed me just now." The other party didn't respond. Huadian was carried ashore and lay in the mud on the shore. Then, the other party ignored him. Do you have to be so ruthless? Huadian's throat was foaming with dirty water and blood, and her vision was blurred. She only saw the man standing by the shore of the lake, reaching out his hand to confirm the position of the setting sun. Then, he gestured in the air with an incomprehensible pattern, continuing his usual practice in the laboratory, as if he was calculating something. Hey, Wanta, Dean Wan, someone is really going to die here. Several seconds later, Vanta, who had finished some calculations, finally responded, Anthony's emergency response is very good. When I pulled you up, I also performed bone setting and partial coagulation for you with the help of the buoyancy of the water. You won't die. It's true. Huadian also noticed that when he was first injured, it was difficult for him to even speak. He felt as if his heart and lungs had been destroyed by the inverted sternum. But now, other than being infected, everything seemed to be fine. He swallowed a mouthful of blood and said, "Thank you." This time, it was a sincere reply. Not for anything else, but for Wanta's previous stance. It would be better if they could be more harmonious in the form. Wanta's attitude did not change because of a "thank you." He looked calm and squatted down to check the restoration of Huadian's sternum. It's okay for now, but it's still very dangerous if we have to travel long distances. Do you have anyone to help? If my team is patient enough, contact them. It's best if they can arrive quickly. If I'm not wrong, we were randomly projected within a radius of more than 70 kilometers, which is not far from each other. The true god is a bit embarrassed at the moment, but mainly because Fat Dragon is trapped in the sandstorm, and he doesn't want to lose such a high-quality believer. Once we slow down, we probably won't be able to escape. F***CK. Huadian immediately operated the communicator and established contact with his team. Fortunately, he had a good character. The communication was quickly connected, and both sides confirmed each other's position. It will take at least 40 minutes for them to send the shuttle over. It will take longer if they fly covertly. Wanta replied with an "oh" and did not show much emotion. He did not care about the muddy environment of the lake and sat next to Huadian. "Lend me your communicator." "My communicator is broken." Huadian quickly handed over the communicator and unlocked the permission. "Just use it." "Do you have anyone to help you? Can it be faster?" "No, it's not that. At present, we can only rely on probability. Then, I just want to send some information to the person who should know the most." Huadian did not understand at first. When he came back to his senses, Wanta had already sent the message and threw the communicator back. "Hey, you are not sending it to Professor Luo, are you?" Wanta did not answer, but Huadian already knew the answer. He felt pain in his chest again. If this message is sent, the auction on the high seas will collapse in the blink of an eye. Do you know that? Wanta did not respond. Hua Dian was about to say something, but suddenly remembered that even the true god could not find the hidden location of the laboratory. Only former members like Luo Yuan could distinguish it. What's the use of sending the approximate location? Or could it be that Wanta could accurately locate it? If so, how did he determine the location of the laboratory? Hua Dian's mind was in a mess. It was meaningless to stop him, but his thoughts were not clear enough to get to the bottom of it. In the end, he could only sigh. Screw you. This is not a good place anyway. I can stop my employer from investing blindly and prevent him from getting involved in the resources that the Amaterasu cult is determined to get. He should give me a bonus for that alone. Use my communicator. If Professor Luo Jr. comes back, I can also establish contact with him. What I saw in the laboratory over the past 10 days might be able to be sold for a good price. Wanta finally said, for every word you speak less, your recovery time will be shortened by an hour. Heh, I was also a man of few words in the past. It must have been infected by that simp, Jingxin. Hua Dian obviously knew her body's condition, but her tense heartstrings and the pressure that continued to rise could only be alleviated through nagging. After all, he was facing an extraordinary. And not just one. This transaction could be said to be a huge loss. It was a huge blow to his business contacts. In the future, all his business in Ban City would probably be abandoned. Hua Dian was annoyed. He shut his mouth and eyes and worked hard to regulate his breathing and heart function. However, there was still a question lingering in his mind that was difficult to solve. Who was it? After surviving a disaster, Hua Dian's mind became more and more clear. He could be sure of one thing, no matter how bad the situation was, the centaur would not kick the true god's ass. The fact that it was out of the norm most likely had a reasonable hidden link to play a role in private. Thinking of the centaur's recent bad state, and the way the two extraordinary Luo Yuan and the true god came, Hua Dian made a logical inference, which made his heart twitch again. Hey, Dean Wan, could it be that in addition to the true god and Luo Yuan, there is another, involved? It was almost the same method, but it was more subtle and traceless. Was he thinking too much? Wanta did not discuss this topic with him. He lowered his head to help Hua Dian knead and deal with the organ tissue in his chest and abdomen. It was a pure physical technique, but it was very sophisticated. Hua Dian's groaning was very useful. Gradually, his mind was a little scattered, and he no longer used his brain. After a few minutes, Wanta suddenly stopped. To be more precise, he moved his hand to Hua Dian's mouth and nose and gently covered it. Hua Dian, who originally closed his eyes to enjoy, suddenly opened his eyes. He was also alert. Without any nonsense, he endured the pain, held his breath, restrained his breath, and only treated himself as a dead man. Only his eyeballs rolled around, trying to figure out the direction of Wanta's attention from his face. Hua Dian's observation was not successful. It was because he had been ejected here before, and he had no concept of the surrounding environment. The range of his spiritual sensing was obviously far from Wanta's. The corresponding observation was meaningless, and it could only make himself more and more confused. However, Hua Dian had the most basic understanding. In the group of people in the laboratory, there were only two, no, maybe three extraordinary who could be treated seriously by Wanta. Which one would it be? A few seconds later, Hua Dian heard some kind of trembling sound wave, which spread unscrupulously on the barren plateau. Because the distance was relatively far, the distortion was very serious, but judging from the rhythm of the breath, it should be laughter, completely unrestrained laughter. For an experienced spy, reasoning and judgment were basic skills. In a few seconds, the faces and personalities of the remaining 5 people in the laboratory went through in his mind, and the basic judgment became clear. Horn demon, only that crazy horn demon would let out such a laugh. However, it was no longer accurate to call him a centaur now. God knows what kind of big shot was hiding behind this madman. Fortunately, it was not the worst result. Less than 10 seconds after this thought flashed in his mind, Huadian suddenly felt dizzy. The bright light from the unknown side, like the parallel suns on the Fusang divine tree, penetrated through the layers of void, making the originally thick and insurmountable barrier become illusory and fragile, collapsing with a touch. From Huadian's angle of looking up at the sky, he could see that the clear sky was suddenly covered with a layer of haze. It was a shadow hand that distorted and expanded in the complex light environment. Huadian could not observe and understand the void dimension, and it slapped down. The light and shadow outline of the natural time and space distorted and melted at this moment, and there was a feeling of the sky collapsing. True God. Chapter 822. Ahaha, this kick is really cool. I've been unhappy with him for a long time. Who are you? Who are you? I've caught you. I've caught you. Under the red sun, the centaur staggered across the wasteland. He suddenly shouted and suddenly laughed. His mouth was still spitting out some illogical words. The current centaur was a madman. But at the same time, he was also a genius. Luo Nan quietly observed and determined the nature of the centaur from thousands of kilometers away. The centaur was indeed a genius. His senses on the mental plane were extremely sharp, and he possessed his own logic. He was able to discover subtleties that were difficult for ordinary people to understand from unexpected angles. He tasted the soil, mud, and powder. He started from the perception of the material and connected to a broader level of information. Luo Nan was still unable to understand the inconceivable aspects. It was no wonder that he was personally recommended by Old Yu despite his eccentric personality. He was one of the people with the greatest potential on the mental side of the Xia City branch. However, success came from geniuses. Failure came from geniuses. The current situation of the centaur was due to the backlash of his talent. Because of his keen perception, he was able to feel the infiltration of Luo Nan's consciousness. He captured the traces of Luo Nan's existence and instinctively sensed the danger. Especially at the moment when he kicked down the true god in the laboratory. This unconventional operation had already exceeded the scope of psychological suggestion. It was completed by Luo Nan's forceful control, thus exposing even more traces. While the space of the laboratory was turbulent, the centaur relied on his talent and his unique sense of smell to trace back and form some sort of spying. The originally one-way conductive line became two-way. This was a fatal link. Compared to Luo Nan's level, the centaur was still far behind. Luo Nan's soul cloak, the multi-layered void interweaved in the sandwich domain, and the altar spider web that had just precipitated a huge amount of information from the abyss world. For the centaur, this entire mental plane structure was equivalent to a small abyss world. It was far beyond the scope of his understanding. Unfortunately, he still forcefully wanted to spy and analyze it. It was tantamount to opening the last throttle. A huge flow of information came crashing down. Luo Nan had already penetrated his mental defenses into 1,000 holes. He could not withstand the impact of the backlash no matter what. Moreover, centaurs didn't have an altar spider web, so there was no possibility of buffer precipitation. Under the impact of the terrifying information flow, the horned demon's mind domain, which had its own logic and rules, shattered like an eggshell. He's done for. Luo Nan was certain that the self-logic system of the horned demon had short-circuited and completely crashed. What he had done, what Luo Nan had manipulated him to do, and his own desires and delusions. They were completely mixed together. Truth and falsehood were unknown. Inside and outside were inseparable. They polluted and degenerated each other. The old order had been destroyed, and there was no possibility of a new order being established. So, the centaur went crazy. If I can't handle it, I'll probably end up like this too. Luo Nan was deeply moved, but there was more lingering fear. Perhaps he was only a step away from this state of insanity. One step away, Luo Nan seemed to understand something. He stood firm and didn't take that step, but the fate of others, like the centaur, was already clear. For example, Grandpa? Once a thought sprouted, it couldn't be stopped and extended to a deeper level. Right at this time, a shadow appeared from behind the void, suppressing over. True God, seems to be really angry. Nonsense. Perhaps the true God, who was kicked into the mist maze, was in a difficult situation for a moment. But at his level, the matter of locating a location in the void was nothing difficult for him. Luo Nan didn't want the true God to stay in the mist maze for too long. In any case, the true God relied on a unique method to anchor the horned demon. He used the horned demon as a fulcrum, intending to travel through space and kill his way over. Luo Nan would certainly refuse. Just get the hell back to Ban City. Using the horned demon as a medium, Luo Nan's soul strength was teleported through space. It pierced the void barrier that was as fragile as a piece of thin paper. The wrestling situation between the two sides took shape in an instant. The true God was fiercer in terms of momentum. The shadow that diffused behind the void displayed the multi-layered and multi-angle effects of the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure. The depths of the shadow contained a flourishing and blazing power like the sun. Once the true form was exposed, the powerful explosive killing power would pour down from the abyss and sweep through everything. It would be invincible. Luo Nan was on the defensive. There was a bit of a gap in cultivation compared to the veteran extraordinaries, but the most important problem was that the horned demon was far too inefficient as a medium. Its mental state had already collapsed, and it had become a bad conductor. From time to time, there would be abnormal electrical resistance, and it greatly affected Luo Nan's control. The shadow had already penetrated the void barrier. It was like a dense shade under the sun. Dots and lines interweaved and scattered. Occasionally, the gap that had yet to be closed would reflect the sharpness of the sun's sharp blade. There were a few gaps on the horned demon's body. Just a slight drop would cause the skin to split open and flesh to split open. Caught you. The true God's telepathic thoughts were even more intense than the sun. He was speaking to the horned demon, but the sharpness of the telepathic thoughts was clearly piercing deeper into the mental domain. What to do? Then, a thought suddenly popped up in Luo Nan's mind. Using soul magnetization is just right. Huh, what the hell was that again? Luo Nan was absent-minded for a moment. Finally, his memories from some time ago were particularly deep. He quickly locked onto the corresponding region. The so-called soul magnetization was a certain scene from the external neurons offline test. The strange thing was that this method did not come from the relay station that Luo Nan had been researching and pondering about all this time. Instead, it came from his opposite, the vassal of the fantasy breed. Luo Nan had some impressions of it, but it was absolutely not as clear and deep as it was now. The information deposited in the abyss world has been activated. This was the only reason Luo Nan received. He was unable to analyze it in depth. The true God's power had already broken through the world and entered. Luo Nan brought out the power of the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure without holding anything back. The power firmly locked onto the horned demon, piercing through the horned demon's fleshly shell. Luo Nan attempted to invade the mental plane and trace back to its roots. Luo Nan needed to organize a solid defense. Then let's do it. The altar's spiderweb seemed to tremble and ripple slightly. Rich and detailed information poured into Luo Nan's mind with this slight movement. The details of the scene from the offline test were so clear and precise that Luo Nan did not need to analyze it. He just needed to draw a ladle from the gourd. Luo Nan was able to realize an extremely similar effect. It was at this very moment that dark clouds and thunder appeared out of thin air outside of the true God's giant shadow palm, and the sunlight blade under the high plateau sky. The scale was far inferior to the scene from the offline test, but the necessary methods were not lacking in the slightest. Lightning curled around the horned demon's body, and mist spread out. The dual power that came from the material plane and the mental plane forcefully brushed down, distorting and even completely changing the structure of the horned demon's body and soul. Luo Nan's consciousness seemed to be assimilated with the mountain range of clouds in the test scene amidst his days. They were indistinguishable from each other. Luo Nan clearly analyzed the marvels of its internal operation, slightly changing the scene, and efficiently using it on this side of the world. The horned demon howled in pain and struggled instinctively. The old and new wounds on its body burst open. It was a tragic sight to behold. But this bit of resistance no longer possessed any practical meaning under the effects of this power that exceeded the scope of his understanding. Mist filled the air, thunder rumbled, and lightning flashed. The horned demon's figure dissipated within the lightning, and then it was reborn. It was also at this moment that Luo Nan truly realized complete control over the horned demon. There was no longer any obstruction between the two. On the wasteland, the horned demon suddenly raised his head to face the piercing sunlight blade. On the mental plane, it pierced through the layers of the void, forming a connection and collision with the gaze of the true God. A continuous stream of lightning and fire burned through the void barrier in an instant. But then it shuttled back and forth, performing the most exquisite of repairs and stitches amidst the chaotic and pervasive cloud of fragmented smoke. The void was destroyed and reborn with it. A new structure was erected behind the front line of the void. It advanced, merged, and corrected. Layer upon layer, it gradually solidified the void gap. This method was a reference to the offline test scene. It was the transit station's defense project of the space-time barrier. From Luo Nan's perspective, this was a matter of course. The situation stabilized a bit, but it was destined to be a bitter battle. Of course, this was not Luo Nan's first time fighting against an extraordinary, but he had never experienced losing and then forcefully turning the tables. He was a bit excited. He made preparations for a long stalemate and confrontation. But at this moment, the true God's reaction exceeded his expectations. A short and undulating syllable penetrated over. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Forgive Luo Nan. He didn't understand what this meant at all. This shouldn't be any language from Earth. Otherwise, the built-in language system of Luo Nan's AI would certainly have done a good job of marking and translating. But on the other hand, the division of syllables and rhythm of the sentence had a strong sense of familiarity, rising and falling in a chaotic sense of contradiction. After bobbing up and down several times, the secret me character symbol suppressed within the core of Luo Nan's consciousness suddenly shone with great radiance. It illuminated his mind, and it combed through the string of syllables once more, forming the meaning of reality. Soul magnetization. The meaning was synchronized, but the special way of expressing it made Luo Nan's heart tremble with fear. The true God on the other side felt that it should be about the same. The true God's oppressive power suddenly shrunk back amidst this atmosphere. It broke away from Luo Nan and quickly vanished into the void, leaving not a trace behind. The wasteland returned to its previous appearance. Only the centaur, an outsider, nailed his body to the wasteland. The setting sun shone on his back, forming a long shadow. There was always an end to the shadow, but the horrified emotions in Luo Nan's mind continued to extend outwards. He wanted to grasp some of the mysteries, but he was still lacking by a thread. At this moment, the external neuron vibrated. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.